call this meeting to order. So our meeting this evening is a city council workshop on infill development. Mayor Hala is on a well-earned vacation tonight, so I'm standing in for him as Mayor Pro Tem. And we are joined by our Assistant City Manager, Brian Phillips, standing in for Steve Schenker, who is also on a well-earned vacation. The only major item on the agenda is our presentation, and I am told that staff is willing to have questions during the presentation. So if you have questions as Kelly and Eloise are going through this, please feel free to ask them. I'll turn it over to you.
All right. So although we're going to be working through a PowerPoint, we did give you a staff report last Friday. And I think the staff report probably helps you focus in at the questions at the end of the presentation, which are the more tangible things that eventually we're going to need direction on. We're not taking action tonight since it's a workshop. My intent is to be able to give you guys background, explain as much as we can, respond to questions, and any kind of comments you guys have about where we might need to go that might help guide me prepare materials for April. That'd be helpful. Otherwise, we'll see where the conversation goes. But yeah, probably break in whenever you have questions or you have details you want to come back to. And then at the end, when we get to the last slide, I'll kind of come back to the staff report and walk through what questions or direct issues we might not have touched upon that you still have questions over.
Kelly, can I just break in? I just wanted to acknowledge that Councilmember Rollins is on Zoom with us.
Correct.
So she will also be participating. And Anita, if you have questions, please speak up as you have them so that we know you're actually asking something.
Thank you. Okay.
Thanks.
All right. So for tonight, we're kind of trying to break this up into three things. Most of you were on council when we adopted Plan 2040, and you might remember the workshop night about growth and land use. And that's really where the conversation came up about what are our land use designations going to be? Are we about more exclusive individual types of allowance for uses, meaning different kinds of specific houses? Or are we going to be more broad in terms of what kind of housing is generally considered compatible across the city? And it wasn't just a conversation about our growth areas. A lot of Plan 2040 was about those scenarios and about growing out into the edges of the city. We had a lot of discussion about infill. Ultimately, infill was valued by the city, but we recognized infill is hard. And that's why we also had to look at those scenarios for growth. So Plan 2040 is in favor of both, understanding that there's difficulties on both ways of doing this on the edge of the city as well as infill. So tonight we're coming back specifically to talk about infill. And I would say that it's really described in two ways. One, what are those smaller scale, maybe citywide types of policies that little increases in density, which we're going to focus on as accessory dwelling units or maybe even duplexes for that, versus the bigger areas that are designed to look at intensification on a bigger or broader scale, which were those reinvestment districts. Then in terms of what is building design and attributes, we had some conversation about compatibility and design with Marty Schukert from RDG while we were doing this. But for the most part, we've landed on policies that really emphasize that context is important. And what does that mean from a planning point of view? What we're talking about is that we're not copying what's next door necessarily, but we're looking at a broader view. How's the block set up? What can you add on to a block or into a neighborhood that's compatible, meaning not a copy, but has similar features, similar scale, even if it's not exactly the same thing. And that's kind of what the bulk of the presentation is about tonight. And the last step is to talk about where we're going to come back and get direction from council. So I already started to talk about this. We are supporting both ideas for growth in the city, infill and expansion. And that middle point is important. This isn't an easy thing to do. Communities across the country are reviewing zoning. Zoning can get a bad rap. It's fairly exclusionary in many places, meaning it's excluding most things and allowing a few things. It's kind of the whole point of zoning. It's not trying to allow a lot of things. It's trying to allow a limited set of things. So cities are going back, reviewing their thoughts, goals, policies from the last 30 plus years and say, are we really accomplishing what we need to as a community? And a lot of cities are doing kind of what we're doing tonight, looking at this through a different lens and saying, is this really what we want to do? What are things we might want to change? But we're trying to do this as a context-based policy, not infill's the only thing we're going to do. We're going to jam as much in as we can because that's our number one goal. That is not our number one goal. It's to accommodate things, but not to necessarily emphasize it. So you're going to have a balancing of priorities. There's not going to be one answer that all 6 of you are going to probably agree on. And I don't know where we're going to land on that continuum of how permissive versus how constraining we're going to be on these policies. But that's kind of what we're trying to get through tonight and then lead into that decision making later. And this also comes up pretty clearly with council goals. You have a goal right now that says we value diverse housing options. You adopted this just over a year ago, right after Plan 2040 was adopted. And the second bullet here is really that implementation tasks related to both your council goal as well as to Plan 2040. So this has been on the list of one of the first priorities council wanted to deal with was what do we mean by infill? How are we going to allow for it? What are we even going to allow for infill with Plan 2040 as the backdrop? This is a slide straight out of Plan 2040 and just reinforces that we are not planning on one type of housing to meet our needs. We are looking for multiple ways to have housing in the city. So this was just one slide that we had out of Plan 2040, kind of talking about a land use mix. You have another table in the neighborhoods and housing and sub-area chapter, which kind of talks about overall housing need, like looking at it from more like an income level and a production of housing that matches income levels. Attached housing is always going to be a little more affordable than detached housing. Even if you make small detached housing, it's going to be slightly more expensive generally than in an attached unit. Square footage matters. It's going to evolve in cost based on how large units are, obviously. So in terms of larger infill concepts, the Lincoln Way Corridor Plan was really our first plan, and it was pre-Plan 2040. We did that about 6 years ago, and it was based on the old land use policy plan, and it identified areas for change. We were working, obviously, on the downtown gateway near Kellogg and Lincoln Way as our first priority. That's the Link development project there, the downtown reinvestment district. That's been our focus. But there were other sub areas all along the corridor that we've kind of set off to the side and said, well, when we get through Plan 2040, someday we'll come back to those. We don't have zoning to implement most of those concepts that are in there. So that's one of those issues. As we get through this, what zoning changes would we want to look at? What are our priorities for addressing those things? And then beyond just the larger focus areas, we in the plan have what we called redirection areas. And those were things that we kind of circled in the plan and said, these look like areas that might be able to transition successfully to a more intense environment from what they are now, but we don't know. So we need more work on that. Maybe it's a sub area plan. Maybe it's neighborhood meetings that is all we need. There might be some other things. And the first time you took that issue on, I see I have a misspelling on the slide. We didn't look at Gove Avenue. We looked at Grove Avenue. Again, about a year ago, you had the neighborhood come forward and say, hey, we would really prefer that you actually downzone this because we have more single family homes on this block than we have multifamily units on the block. And you also had multifamily apartment owners saying, you know what, we're okay with that. You can take us down a zone. It doesn't really change how our current apartments work. And council in that case said, we're going to downzone and we're going to take it towards single family, lower density options rather than keep it at the higher density and more of an infill redevelopment option. So that's an example of the redirection area. It didn't guarantee that we were going to intensify. It was going to be a case-by-case review by council. And there's a number of these across the city that eventually we'll work through as kind of a work plan with Plan 2040 and the council over time. So this was another graphic we had in the plan. The blue areas were kind of trying to show where we think growth and change could happen. A couple of them are on the edge of the city, but it was mostly trying to look at opportunity sites in the city. There's a number of those that are just essentially vacant lots or undeveloped lots in the city. Now, this is kind of that it helped shape the redirection area concept, but the broader concept of duplexes and accessory dwelling units, that could be anywhere. It's not just for the blue areas. So this is just kind of give you a sense of where those opportunity sites may be on a larger scale versus what can we spread across the city on smaller sites. Here's an excerpt from the corridor plan. I think you've seen these diagrams before. They're just ideas on how redevelopment could occur. What I want to look at specifically is that campus town transition area. So this would be to the west of Highland. That's an area where you have a lot of smaller, older homes, properties, primarily rental properties. And the emphasis there was how can we kind of improve the aesthetics there, get newer buildings, maybe rehab buildings. How do you motivate landlords that have rental property that's income property now to make improvements to those properties? Are there allowances we can do for other housing types that kind of fit everybody's goal and let's reinforce this as a transit corridor. Where it's the most logical place probably to add density in the whole city is on the west side in the Lincoln Way corridor area. So that's one of those primary areas. And then Oak Riverside is the contrast to that, where we tried to essentially take concepts that we're talking about tonight and say, where can we strategically and minimally add additional units in the Lincoln Way corridor? And the neighborhood was not in favor of that. They had other priorities in terms of reinvestment for ownership housing, wanting to maintain the character of the single family homes there rather than demolish things and replace them. So you have a completely different feel and an approach to the Oak Riverside versus the Campus Town transition area. And again, you had these conversations about 6 years ago. They're the same things we're going to be talking about over the next couple of years if we pursue changes across the city. Diagrams, again, from Plan 2040. We had these exercises with RDG. They took a couple of sample areas for the city. This one is south of campus. It's one of those redirection areas where it's been held at a lower density from the old land use policy plan. But if we're talking about strategic infill, this is probably one of those places that we can look at doing that. And this was an example from RDG to look at how maybe consolidation of properties helps do multifamily. Maybe there's some townhome options to be built in here just to try and give you a sense of things that could be done to gain a few. In this case, this version shows a tripling of density. Now, whether that's really possible when you account for parking, I don't know that that's true, but RDG is trying to help visualize things and sketch things out for us in different times. One of the areas we got to get to eventually is in terms of what are our priorities for infill from an area perspective. We have this RN4 designation here, which is like West Street, Howard and Campus Avenue, and then neighborhood commercial in the middle. The way that we kind of talked about this is we call Somerset a village. This is kind of organically a village because it was built out over many decades with a little bit of commercial, a mix of housing types, and a lot of different things happening here. Again, we have overlays that restrict infill. Is that what we want to maintain for the next 20 years? Or do we want to look at options that make this more developable to reach intensification goals we might have? And then again, the Lincoln Way corridor right here, we have a land use designation called corridor. We have no zoning district to implement. So right now, if somebody wants to redevelop on Lincoln Way, I have to say, I'm sorry. I know the plan is in favor of this, but I have no zoning district that allows for you to do what the plan wants to be done at this point.
Kelly, have you been asked?
Not lately. There is a couple of properties on that corridor where someone might own 2 or 3 properties. And if they knew what they could do, maybe they would pursue combining 2 or 3 properties to come up with a smaller apartment project or something along those lines. In the last year, I have had one person on Campus Avenue that had bought an old house and they were just struggling with, it's a rental property. Do I really want to rehab this rental or can I do something better? And I had to say, well, zoned RL, you can't do better, even though long-term, I think we do want to see better. So they had to make that choice. Do I invest now in rehabbing something and giving it another 15 years of life? Or is the city going to let me put 3 units here as a townhome instead of 1 unit here as a rental? Those are the kinds of things where zoning starts to matter. We can have policy, but without the zoning, you don't see it happen.
So are we going to be talking about this subject later on?
So tonight's is kind of the broad overview. I think eventually I need to get direction on, are we going to take areas like, let's say that RN4, and you're going to say, staff, bring me back a zoning district overlay that allows for these things to happen and spells out how that's going to work. And then we have the citywide issues about accessory living units and duplexes that are kind of separate from this.
I apologize. I completely did not know or remember that Lincoln Way corridor area did not have a zoning classification. And I don't believe I've ever been contacted about that.
So
that sure seems like low-hanging fruit.
We have zoning. We don't have zoning that allows for the vision of the corridor plan.
Right. So it's an RL now.
Most of it's RL, or it's a lower version of, or it has the university overlay on it, which kind of restricts things and really emphasizes additional parking to manage intensity. So we didn't come to talk in great detail about that, but this is one of those areas where I think it's right for a greater discussion about whether the current zoning makes really sense for how our vision is articulated in Plan 2040.
And remind me, on the Oak Elm, the stretch along Lincoln Way.
It's bottom left, yeah.
What is that zone now?
It's UCRM. So it's a zone that allows everything that's there to exist, but only a single family home can be created new.
Okay.
So it's a strange hybrid of old medium density with only new single family allowed.
Okay. So if we wanted to have some conversations about areas that are currently RL, and we wanted to look at whether there's merit to revisiting the zoning classification to encourage intensification, that would be a topic that we could bring up in a future meeting. Am I
Yeah, I
saying
think-
that right?
Yeah, and Oak Riverside, I think specifically was put in the near campus overlay rather than into a redirection area. So that conversation over 5+ years with Oak Riverside, the land use decision was to keep it as is for now, and it did not become a priority area for redevelopment. Whereas this slide's focused on areas that might be a lot easier to see redevelopment happen. But yes, you could bring back another larger area for conversation at any point in time.
Okay, thank you.
One other diagram, this is again to the east of Oak Riverside, and then north of the tracks where Wheatsfield is one of those redirection areas where it sure seems like that combination of land use patterns here, the property sizes, they seem like there might be more that could be done here, and it's right next to downtown. It seems to be a great choice to look at intensification and have it be a strategic option for us. I think the biggest one that we ever tackled, I know it is, was we looked at downtown Gateway at Kellogg as being our focus. Like that is number one for us. It complements downtown the most. But we talked about what could we do east of Duff. So RDG put a version together about what if we could redevelop everything east of Duff into a mix of housing and commercial and multifamily and just kind of wholesale see change here. That's what this sketch was about. I think what we landed on, as long as we're going to have a resource recycling plant as a neighbor, along with some other industrial and commercial uses here, it was not high on our priority list. It just is not a good neighbor to think about that. But over time, maybe we can revisit this and see how redevelopment options work. If we ever do the Cherry Street extension, that's something that would play into this idea. Cherry Street may not have merit on its own as a street extension, but if it's in combination with other land use changes, maybe there's a different answer to how Cherry Street works as an extension off of Southeast 5th and 3rd.
Kelly, remind us, when was the RDG? Was that done at the same time as the Lincoln Way?
No, it was done as part of Plan 2040. So these sketches that we have, we had a workshop about growth, and they were tasked as part of a, what do they call it? They had a workshop, they had a design session basically where they spent a day kind of sketching out redevelopment options to illustrate the concepts. And that's why we have a few of these in Plan 2040. So it's not like it's a really well thought out master plan. It was a RDG saying, hey, we've seen these building types work. Maybe this is a way this could get rearranged. And it was part of a workshop that we did as part of Plan 2040.
Great, thanks.
Okay. And then on the left, you still have South Lincoln mixed use, which is from Walnut over to Duff. That's a hybrid area now. It's a zoning district that was put in place with, I think, great intentions of trying to allow for a mix of things to happen in terms of compatibility and context. We just haven't really seen much happen in this area. So is that the zoning's issue? Is it the market's issue? I don't know, but it's one of those areas that probably needs to be revisited also to see if maybe there's something that can be unlocked there that's beneficial to the community for infill opportunities too.
Isn't that the area where the Bridge Home is
They're on
seeking
the
redevelop?
northeast edge. Yeah. So they're on, Sherman and Second, I believe, are the two properties that they're looking at for their bridge projects. But everything to the west and to the south is also part of that area. So I'm not going to go through these in detail. We have an RN 1, 2, 3, and 4 land use designations. RN 1, these were all based on kind of trying to match historical development patterns rather than focus on density. So our older land use plan was a lot about density and not so much about character. The new one's trying to say these neighborhoods were built differently. They should be treated and looked at differently than something that was built in 1990 versus 1930. So these land use designations that we list here, that's just a refresher on what we adopted, trying to describe the nature of neighborhoods in these areas. And then our policies in there, we have actions related to these about whether or what type of infill might be appropriate in these areas. So each land use designation tried to talk about concepts that we might need to explore. And that's, again, why we're back here tonight, to talk about what do we really want to look at in greater detail. So I'm just kind of, again, we have existing neighbors, established neighbors, expansion, and then RN4 is that village concept. Any questions about the land use designations at this point? Okay. So from zoning, this is really interesting for our city, at least if you're a planner, maybe not for everybody else. So this bullet here, we had old zoning in the 80s and 90s that allowed for duplexes and conversions of homes with quite a few stipulations. And then eventually it kept getting more restricted. And we got to the year 2000, where the concepts of the 97 land use plan were, we really want to maintain the current integrity of neighborhoods at the core of the city, not see them change, and look for change really on the edge of the city in those targeted growth areas of the 97 plan. So to implement that vision, they had to change the whole zoning ordinance. So in 2000, they adopted a whole new zoning ordinance, and duplexes basically left our vocabulary in the city of Ames. So all the existing ones were basically grandfathered under this term pre-existing. And if you're pre-existing, you get a free pass, you get to be what you are, you can do additions, remodel, add on, do whatever, but no new ones could be built. And then there was a thing in the 80s called retroactive conversion permits. So these were essentially bootlegged apartments in houses that didn't have permits. The city had to go into kind of a code enforcement mode through inspections and identify these, gave people an opportunity to apply for a permit, to try to make them legal, try to make rental code. But it was really this effort to stop seeing bootlegged conversions, allowing for single family homes to kind of get carved up into multiple units across the community. This wasn't just concentrated in one area. The retroactive conversion permits were across the city. But then again, we stopped allowing for these conversions. They were just, this is it, we're done, they're not working, we don't want these in the neighborhoods, so we're changing zoning to not allow for them. And then so now currently, no duplexes are really allowed in any of the FSRL, RL, UCRM, those base zones. And then we also have a standard, you can't have more than one unit on a lot. And that would be what gets you into the situation where an accessory dwelling unit is not permissible conceptually. There's some specific zoning that stops that from happening, but just conceptually, you're not allowed to have 2 units on a lot that are detached. And that's what that gets to. So that's where we're at with zoning now.
Kelly, then with those, what you're calling the bootleg permits, that is primarily focused on the conversion of single-family homes to multiple unit dwellings.
So my recollection is the specific retroactive conversion permits were single families becoming essentially 2-family homes. I don't think it was the carving up of an older home into 3, 4, or 5 units.
I think it was because I have a
some of
bunch of
those?
those across the
Okay.
street from me.
The ones I'm familiar with are 2-family, but I think there was almost 300 properties that were involved in that retroactive conversion permit process of identifying them, asking, are you going to try to make this a code compliant structure, and do a lot of things. It was a substantial number of properties across the city.
And that resulted in those being now considered non-conforming, or
Sort of. So that retroactive conversion permit was a process where you could go to the zoning board of adjustment to essentially legalize your illegal unit, but you had to meet rental code requirements too. And once in a while, there might have been dispensation, oh, ceiling height doesn't quite meet rental code, but we'll let that part go because you can meet egress and everything else that we need to do. So there was like a little bit of a give and take. But if you really couldn't meet the standards, that conversion permit was not a guarantee that you would get permitted. You might just have to stop renting your basement or whatever else you were doing. And so they got a special tag. They were labeled retroactive conversion permits, and they were carved out in the zoning ordinance as their own thing, separate from 2-family homes and separate from other types of multifamily units. So they were always treated differently in the 80s and 90s once that happened. But then in 2000, again, it left our vocabulary because no version of a 2-family home was really allowed to be built. But the old ones were all grandfathered as pre-existing, and they would have been sort of captured under that. It kind of depended on how those permits were approved in the 80s.
That's my house.
You're a retroactive conversion permit?
I don't know if it was retroactive or if they got it, but it was it was 2 units when I bought it with an upstairs tenant. It's kind of an interesting. So we took the walls out and just like reattached the 2 units, but there's a kitchenette up there, a separate bathroom, everything. So it functions like its own little apartment.
Yeah. So you could have legally converted some. It wasn't that you couldn't have a 2-family unit in a lot of parts of the city. The retroactive is really on those that were not supposed to have them or hadn't done it without permits. So some zones did allow for conversions, especially. So from what I could gather from my research today, 1983 was the watershed year of changing everything. So a lot of the old codes picked November 1st of 1983 as either you existed or you didn't. You had permits and existed in 83, you were grandfathered, and then everything else had new standards. You couldn't just convert a house. So starting in 83, maybe there were some other things too, but in 83 is when this old R2 zone that allowed for almost anything to happen was chopped up into smaller pieces, and more restrictions were placed on duplexes in 1983. So we created more zoning districts, broke the city up into more pieces. And that was the big time for that council. From what I can tell, they spent a lot of time in 83 looking at this issue of conversions and duplexes.
And do we know why that is?
It was a little, I don't know that I have a great insight into that. Some of the commentary in the minutes was in response to neighborhoods concerned about just the amount of rental units and again, chopping up buildings. I think Old Town was not R2 zoning. It's R3 and R4 in the old days. It's RM now. So it wasn't exactly the same thing for Old Town. But the areas like north of 13th Street, to the east of Duff, to the west side of Grand, those are areas that were all R2. And you had a lot of conversions and other things happening in those areas. And I think it was a response to some degree to neighborhoods wanting to say, hey, enough is enough. We want to see single family homes stay single family homes, which is interesting because we also had standards that if you platted a new subdivision, you were allowed to have duplexes in a certain ratio. That came late though. So it wasn't like a pre-planned arrangement of duplexes for a couple of decades. They were, I think, just kind of organically happening as people bought properties and wanted to convert them. We had a lot of conversions. If you go into Beacon, and this has been an issue with rental concentration conversations and different things with Sarah Van Meteren and inspections, when you go into Beacon and start looking at what the property records are and it's converted from, well, it was built as a house, but somebody else chopped it up into something else in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. A lot of that stuff happened. And I think 83 is when we'd really tried to change our approach to allowing for that. We wanted more planned and predictable housing situations is what I'm gathering from that.
Thanks.
I think we just went through all of that. Yeah, I think we covered all that. So we transitioned into to say, hey, duplexes do exist in the city. There's no doubt about that. I think nearly 1,000 from the census inventory of the city. So it's not like there's a small number in the city. There's quite a few. You can see like the top picture, you can see 3, 4 in a row. You can see little clusters of it happened on corners of different blocks. You can see them scattered in neighborhoods too. So you can kind of see them in a lot of different places. I think we tried to give you a good broad example. Some I would say are things we might want to repeat. Others are probably not things you want to repeat if you're saying I want to do compatible contextual design. So again, some of these are carved up units. Some of them are intentionally built as multiplexes. There's a variety across town. And again, these are the 3 that have been built in the last 8 years. Again, unless you're in a high density zone and just happen to have a lot that doesn't really let you build apartments because it's a smaller, older lot, that's when we got these little products to be built. And then there are also some 3plexes. We're not really focused on that tonight, but those are some of those other multifamily units that you can see in different places across the community. Not as many of them. It was mostly focused on duplexes from our research, but there are a few of these kind of conversions around town or purpose-built things as well. Yeah. So infill, that second bullet's kind of, again, why we're here tonight. Our current ordinance doesn't allow for concepts that are in Plan 2040 for the most part. So if we want to implement, or to what degree do we want to follow Plan 2040, zoning changes are necessary. And that's really what we're trying to get to at the heart here. In my opinion, that last bullet down there, I believe our intent, and I was here, so I hope I got this right. I think our intent was to look at how do we add for 1 or 2 units? How do we add one more to a site logically, rather than saying we want to tear down 3 houses and build 12?
Yes.
I think they're 2 different things. And I think we're focused on how to do 1 or 2, except for those redirection areas, except for those areas where we think we can handle more density, and it makes a ton of sense for us to do that. So with this, Eloise is going to walk through the examples. So we had a couple of different building types for you, and then we'll come back to some specifics here. So
this might be a graphic you've seen before. It's typically called missing middle. And some cities have evaluated the fact that in a lot of cases, you have the low density on the left and you have more of the higher density on the right, but you may not have anything in between. And that's kind of what we're seeing and what's currently being built today in Ames. We're not seeing much of the lower density duplex, triplex, fourplex being built because, if, like Kelly said, if you have a lot that's zoned for higher density, you're going to do economies of scale and you get more return on your investment if you can put more units. So they're not as interested in just doing a duplex or a triplex. Next slide. So this is just a graphic showing some different elevations of units. Next slide. This graphic is alley loaded, so you don't see parking, but it does show a variety of types of units, from the single family to the 2-family, 3 and 4 plex. So, and the way they are architecturally designed, they all have porches, so they all have a neighborhood feel. They wouldn't have to have that neighborhood feel if they didn't duplicate some of the features that would have been in the area on the block. So that's part of what we're going to be talking about as well. But parking would not have to be from an alley. Shared parking could also work. And that's a discussion we should have, because right now shared parking isn't a concept within our residential districts that's supported in the code. Next. So accessory dwelling units, which you've probably heard a lot about. There's a lot of places that have implemented them. And what it can be is it can be a detached unit on the property. It can be attached as an addition. It could be an interior upper level in an attic or in a basement, or it could be something above the garage, or it could be a garage conversion. So all of these methods are ways that accessory dwelling units can be implemented. So they come in many shapes and sizes, and there's lots of varieties and ways to slice the pie if you're interested.
I want to jump in for 1 second.
Sure.
So one thing with accessory dwelling units, since we don't have it in the code now, it's not a defined thing. The way we would look at this as planning and zoning is a dwelling unit has to have a place to sleep, a place to eat, and it has to have bathing or bathroom facilities. If you don't have those 3 things under the building code, you're not a living unit. So in Ames, you can have 2, like your situation, you could have 2 kitchens. You can have an upstairs kitchen and a downstairs kitchen. What we're saying with an accessory dwelling unit is it would be a fully independent unit. You would not access this through somebody else's home. So that's another issue with inspections and with rental code, is you can't walk through somebody else's home and claim you have another unit somewhere else. We're going to look at that as a whole house and limit you to the 3, 4, or 5 adults under the rental code, unless you have a separate entrance, separate heating and cooling, water supply, and then again, eating, sleeping, and bathing facilities. So that's what we're talking about, is something you can't do now, is create that independent, fully independent unit accessible from the exterior without going through someone else's home.
Kelly, could you just do a quick reminder on the concept of roomers?
So zoning doesn't deal with roomers. It's I'm going to try to do my best. So for inspections, a roomer is an exemption from having to register your property as a rental for if you have that one allowance. And I'm not even sure, do we still have that in the rental code?
So I don't think we do.
I think we dropped it.
I think that's right.
I think when we were doing all that work on rental concentration and redefining occupancies, I feel like we dropped rumor.
I thought we left the rumor.
So I'm not going to say I'm an expert on
No.
that, but it used to mean you could have that one rumor and not register it as a rental property. But that meant it was an owner occupied house that had one renter in it. If it was all renters and the owner did not live there, you didn't get that exemption from the rental code.
So I'm just brainstorming. I mean, tonight we're going to do lots of brainstorming. I'm not suggesting that anything has merit to it. A small world. My father-in-law was a architectural student here in the 1950s. And there was a period of time when he rented a room from an older lady in the community. She needed help with some of the housework and he needed a place to live, and it worked great. And as we think about increasing density, and we have people for whom that kind of living arrangement might make sense, would that be something we could think about in terms of increasing density without, this accessory dwelling requires a lot of thought and,
Investment. I mean,
investment, yeah.
Yep.
But a rumor is pretty low hanging fruit in terms of being able to increase density without a lot of work. Is that something that we could think about?
We can. I'm not sure that it isn't already allowed. So we already allow for 3 adults in a single family home through the rental. This is all rental code conversation since the
Right.
rumor is not an issue for zoning directly. I'd have to look at that. I'm not sure that it isn't already allowed. I mean, if I'm just a couple in a house and I want to rent a room to somebody, that's allowed. You probably have to register that whole property as a rental.
That's easier said than done sometimes.
Sometimes, right? I mean, there's a reason we have a rental code. Not all structures are great for their condition, for having absentee owners and occupants that are not in control.
We do allow rumors.
We still have that exemption
Yeah.
for owner occupied.
Yes.
So it's one rumor is allowed without having to register your property as a rental. So that would fit that scenario you just described.
I have to do some more research on that. I don't know that's used very much.
I don't know that we would know because you don't have to register with us.
Mhm.
That's you don't register with us and then we exempt you from the code. You don't even have to apply to be
Right.
registered with us. So I think it'd be hard for us to gauge how many quote rumors there are in the city.
Okay, thank you.
So Kelly, I may be getting off course here, but one of the things I took away from what you said was if I, in my single family home, decided I wanted to add, let's say, a basement kitchen and bathroom, because my husband likes to play poker and, wants to have that facility in the basement, that could be considered as a separate dwelling unit because it would have all of the requirements. But as long as I'm not renting it to somebody and I'm just using it as my own home, it's not an accessory dwelling unit, or it is an accessory dwelling unit that's simply not being used.
So there's 2 levels to that. The first part of that, saying if I have a kitchen and a bathroom in the basement, it's not a separate dwelling unit unless it exclusively has access to the exterior, not through the home. So if the only way into your basement and has all those features, if the only way there is through your house, it's not a living unit.
Okay.
It's just habitable space in your house.
So let's say I don't want any of his poker buddies coming through the house, so I put in that separate entrance. My husband doesn't play poker.
So it would have to be. So we had a lot of conversations, inspections. Like we can't allow for building permits to be issued that would lead to uses of homes or property that are inconsistent with the zoning ordinance. So even though if you don't intend to register it as a rental, we don't let you build a second unit on your property because it just leads to non-compliance in the future.
Right,
So
because I
again-
could sell the house to somebody who
But
says, hey.
so
this
it's
is
pretty
great.
obvious, right? We can have a walkout ranch home. You have a patio that goes out the bottom of your home and you have a stairs up inside. That's not a separate living unit just because you have a door to the outside. It's that fact that you have an internal connection within the home, it's still one home. So unless you're going to close off all interaction with the unit above and only have a door to the outside, would we step in on a zoning level and say, can't do that? That's a second unit.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Okay. Yeah. So the rental code doesn't really impact the configuration, what's allowable in that main building. It applies when you want to rent it, that you're making a space that's habitable for other people and meets our expectations for safety and quality, but it doesn't lead to the building permit directly. So back to Eloise.
Next. So we're going to go through some of these options that would be for an infill area. And some of it applies also to ADUs or to just adding another unit on a lot. But we'll start with this one. This is duplexes, or as we talk about in our code, two-family dwellings. In many cases, the duplexes do have two entrances on the front facade for each unit. And we require 2 parking spaces for each unit. So that becomes an important factor to consider when developing how you're going to accommodate 4 parking spaces, at least as it currently is in the code. So typically with a duplex, it's on one lot, 2 units. In many cases, both units are rented. Sometimes one is owner occupied, but both units may be rented as we currently have them. Next, townhomes. Townhomes that's not a term in our zoning ordinance. We typically call them single family attached, or sometimes they're apartments that are attached. But here's some images for you to look at. Typically townhomes do have that separation of each unit that gives some kind of street appeal to give the effect of an individual unit, whereas a condominium or an apartment may just be one big block. However, the image on the right is what's called a slot building. And these have not been outlawed in Denver, but they were really taking off a lot for a while. And did not provide the type of street frontage effect that is desired, and just became a massive volume of space. And I think that one actually looks kind of like a prison based on the windows, which are lacking. So, but townhomes do also have some variety in how they are structured, and the one on the left is Somerset. So we've tried to include some local examples as well.
I think that bottom right picture really illustrates what we think we're trying to avoid. If you just say, I'm allowed 6 units on that property, you're going to get the most efficient 6 units possible. And that version of a townhome is what you will get. That has been repeated across the country. Denver's the one that kind of coined the slot house term. And they spent a lot of time trying to undo their zoning because they wanted infill. And they saw this as the pattern and said, that's not what we meant. And they had to go back and kind of change their zoning to ensure that they had front doors that face street. You had identifiable units. You had other techniques to make it look like it was a home rather than just how do we get the most units onto this property. So I think that's one of our better examples of what I don't think we're trying to do. We're not trying to design by density here. We're trying to design the other way, saying this looks like a good neighborhood where I'd want to be.
So the slot housing is not necessarily paired like this to create a slot. It's the orientation on the lot that puts the side of the building to the street.
Yeah, I would say to me, the number one attribute that is the negative attribute is that you're getting a side relief of the building and there's no interaction with any of the units with the street. And there's really no personal space either. And that can come and go in terms of whether that's a priority about private space for the units or not. But it was really this walled off effect along the street that they were getting with 3-story units. So that's the other thing is modern building codes. Like you're going to, on a townhome, 3-story unit's going to get you more square footage, get you that extra, especially in Ames, it's going to get you that extra bedroom. There used to be in the building code, I think it was prior to 2005, you couldn't have a 3rd story more than 500 square feet unless you had a second exit. So townhomes used to be more compact and have more relief because that third level couldn't just be straight up. But then the building code change said, now you don't need a second exit. If you're a 3-story space, you can just go straight up and meet building code. So we didn't have any help from the building code in terms of design. So now that zoning wasn't prepared for that. So now you can build a 3-story square because there's no building code or fire code issues with that anymore. And one thing that's important on townhomes, and this comes up with different experiences, the building code does have townhomes. It's important because the building code considers apartments commercial, but they consider townhomes residential. So you use 2 different building codes depending on how you label that building and how many units are totally involved. And what's key is that there's no unit above you in that residential townhome building code. If you have a unit above, you have to be an apartment under the commercial code, and you're going to trigger fire sprinklers and all this other stuff. So even though there's no lot separating any of those homes, we will permit things through the building code as townhomes, but the zoning ordinance doesn't recognize them as that. We consider them apartments because they're all on one lot. And sometimes that's confusing because the building code uses a different term that the zoning ordinance doesn't use.
So Kelly, would you want us to consider adding the townhome designation? Would there be value to that from a planning perspective?
I think in some of those, I do. I think if we get to the point where we're going to define building types that we think fit and what those features are, I think we're going to write a standard for a townhome and what that means, what that looks like. And I think you'll see, I guess it's not on this slide, one of those key bullets is if you do that, are you willing to park it like a single family home rather than like an apartment? So a 3-bedroom apartment needs 3 parking spaces. A 3-bedroom single family attached home needs 2. So if you really want to see this product type and you want to incent it,
Less parking.
I'm saying you need to treat it like a house rather than like an apartment. Now, I don't want 5-bedroom townhomes because I'm pretty sure we're getting gamed as an apartment at that point. But if we're talking standard 3-bedroom townhouse, I'm pretty comfortable that 2 spaces is the same, whether it's owner occupied or renter occupied.
And I apologize, maybe this is obvious, but I'm trying to find takeaways from tonight's workshop. So this is my second one. And so we would ask staff to look at adding townhomes into the what? To the zoning?
So
What is it, where we're adding it to?
So I think there's two approaches. If we make it as a building type and you want to encourage it, you probably need to put it into the parking section of the zoning ordinance and say it's treated differently than apartments. But on a broader level, if this is a type of housing we think is compatible with the surroundings, it's going to come back into those broader areas where we want to say how that building is allowable on that lot and probably have another name for it. So it's not considered a 2-family and it's not considered an apartment. And it'll be design based rather than density based. All our other uses are like density based. They don't have design elements to them.
So that's way too confusing for a motion.
Yes.
What if we just left it broadly to ask staff to come back with recommendations or options for adding townhomes to the city code, would that give you enough flexibility to bring something back to council?
Yeah. And I'm just trying to say there's two issues with that. One would be parking and one would be we would have to design it differently based on how it looks rather than its density, which is how we treat all the other buildings.
And I guess in particular, since we don't have full council night, I would like to give council the opportunity to hear your recommendations, pros and cons, and so we could think through it. So I would just make not now, but when do you want motions?
We won't be taking motions tonight. April is when you're.
So I mean, if you have direction to ask us to bring something back, that's fine. I think we can deal with that. You won't be making decisions on what you really want to do as a package until April. We'll come back and let everybody kind of let this sink in and say, hey, this is what I think a priority is.
But it would be helpful for you if
you
knew
like,
that
hey,
we're
I would
all
like
right
more
with
information.
duplexes, we're all right with townhome, like that kind of thing.
Or I want more information on townhomes. What would that mean? We can respond then in April and say, this is how we would address this. And then you could tell us, yes, I want to do that or not.
So just because it perhaps is a little easier just in the context and the flow of the workshop tonight, I'd like to go ahead and make a motion that we ask staff to bring us back options of what it would mean to add townhomes to the city code.
Is there a
I'll second.
second? It's
Um,
been moved and seconded that we bring back information on what it would mean. Do we have discussion?
I was wondering if you might want to add duplexes, triplexes to that too, right? That's same
those are
type
already-
of thing,
So duplexes,
They're
two-family
already
homes already
defined.
exist in the code.
but they're not allowed.
They're not allowed. So I think that's a different
Different motion.
That's a different topic than this.
Okay.
Because what we're trying to point out here is if you like these buildings, nothing in zoning gets you this building.
Sure.
So we would need to create a way to define that, to tell people this is what we want.
Okay.
And that would be what Tim, well, this is how I'm understanding Tim's motion is how do
Separate from
how do you allow this to happen or get this to happen?
Okay. Yeah. Got it. Thank you.
Any other input on that? Those in favor, say aye.
I
Those opposed, nay. Motion carries.
So you may recall the Delaware project where they were asking to put in something other than RL density. And so it actually went through a LUPP amendment as well as a zoning amendment to allow what ultimately became a development with townhomes. And it was 6 townhomes, and it shows you the site plan and how they were configured, and it talks a little bit on the slide about what some of the challenges were. So they could have had other options. They could have had small lot homes, courtyard homes, could have done a row of row houses up to the street. And some of the challenges were dealing with the fire access, the length of the lane, parking, which is always, it takes up land. And so you always have to have it front and center to accommodate the code. So that we feel that was a success as an infill project because staff was able to work with the applicant to come up with some solution to try to provide some private outdoor space to each unit and to find a way to make this vacant lot something that could be developed.
This is under construction right now. So this summer you'll be able to see what the fruits of the effort are. So it worked on this lot. I think we don't have a ton of these lots in the city, unfortunately. So I hate to compare us to other cities when other cities have a different available lots than we do. It's just not really fair to when we have very few of these half-acre, 3/4 of an acre types of lots where we can do more than one house really successfully. They're just not available. And you're going to hear other people say, oh, we're doing all this infill. Well, it's because they have vacant lots. They're removing blight. We don't have a lot of blight. It's just, that's good. So I don't want to get trapped by the idea that you have to do infill to be successful. We want to take advantage of it when we can.
So I don't know if you've heard of a pocket neighborhood, cottage neighborhood. Sometimes they're called green. Well, it eludes me. But the idea is you have small units that face a green courtyard. I think green courtyard housing is what it was called. And this concept actually started in Denmark, and then in the United States, it kind of started around 1990 out west. And there's been quite a few developments on the West Coast that implement this design with the central courtyard. All the units face the courtyard, so you have this common green space, and you have the units surrounding the common green space. And the example on the left, you have a parking lot essentially with some garage parking. Also, looking at how it interacts with the street. So in this case, it just has a parking lot that comes into the site, but doesn't encircle the site with a drive. The development on the right is slightly different because it actually has a drive or alley that allows access to the rear of each unit. So you actually have a garage on the back side of each unit. Typically, they don't have garages, but they could, and that shows an example of how that could be accommodated. But typically, it's not a large acreage and not a large number of units. The first slide, those units were only 650 square feet of a footprint, so very small. Doesn't mean they have to be that small, but the idea is there are no lot lines. Well, the one on the right looks to have lot lines, but typically they're all on one lot. So there's some varieties in how they're implemented.
Eloise, before we move on from that, so in real estate conveyancing, if they're lots, then you would convey the lot. If they're just the structures, are they condominiums then?
Yes, they could be sold as condominiums. I think that's typically how they're done. So that you have a shared common area that everyone owns, and everyone owns the land under all of the units, but the units themselves are owned by individuals.
Well, you've chosen an absolutely lovely picture of this.
Isn't it
Why?
beautiful?
They always look beautiful.
Yeah.
You see the pictures, you just don't see them enough. Like,
So, do you folks have thoughts as planners about? You brought this to us for a reason, for consideration. Is this something that you think the council should consider adding to our portfolio of housing types?
I think it's another way, like, let's flip back to Delaware. Let's say I don't have a way to permit the pocket neighborhood. I don't have any zoning that
Right.
or any mechanism to allow you to do it. So let's say this piece wanted to put 6 detached homes on it. That cottage neighborhood could have worked. I didn't have a way to permit it. The developer didn't ask for it either at that time, but that would be another way to say, look, I can do detached structures that fit the neighborhood. I just have to be able to push them across the whole lot. They're not all going to be on the front of the street. I think it's a great way to add 6 units to a lot. It has less mass. It has a little bit more space. It's a way to just get a couple more units on a site, which I think is what we're trying to get to, is how do you get a couple more units that really fit the property and fit the surroundings. So I think we should allow it. It's probably a version of a PUD to allow it. Right now we have in our PUD ordinance is you have to have at least 2 acres to use it, because we didn't want it to be a tool that allowed for little changes across the city, because it'd be kind of maybe viewed as spot zoning. So we wanted to make sure that we kept it at a larger size right now. If we're interested in that pocket neighborhood or some other version, we'd have to create some other tool to do it.
So we occasionally get emails from people interested in the tiny house model.
Uh-huh.
Is that something that some cities have incorporated into this structure?
I mean, you could like use 650 on that. Tiny house means a lot of different things in my experience in answering planning and zoning calls from
Right.
customers. Is it a tiny home on a trailer that's like 120 square feet? Is it a house that's really 400 square feet? I don't think this is meant to be that like mobile tiny home kind of situation. And we would only allow that in a mobile home park.
Mhm. I'm curious if council has an interest in this. I mean,
Mayor Hala has expressed interest in this several times over the last few years, so I know
Yeah, I
he's
think-
interested.
Mhm.
This would be, although there are examples, I think it takes an entrepreneurial developer that wants to build something that isn't in the city. It's not a proven product. So I think this would be successful. I think you could find 8 to 10 people that want to live in a communal kind of situation and aren't concerned about their garage being how they walk out of their car into their house. But it is a riskier thing since we don't have a proven model in the city, but it also needs zoning that allows it too. So I think it might be a lower priority, but I would like to be able to offer this as an option on a site.
all right, just to keep things moving, I will move that we ask staff to bring us back a proposal for pocket or cottage neighborhoods.
Second.
Any discussion? Those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries. Can I just ask how that compares to what's being done at Damani?
So Damani are still, I think they're at least 5,000 square foot lots. So each unit is on their own individually individual lot that can be owned.
But they've got reduced setbacks,
They
right?
have reduced setbacks. So they're not organized in any way around common space that's shared. It's my lot, smaller lot, very little setback. There's some community space in the projects, but they're not organized around that. That same idea of the pocket neighborhood, if you're doing larger, at least I had a lot of experience with this in California, a lot of townhome projects will take that same approach and build townhomes around that common square as a way to open space up to. This is really focused on detached units rather than attached units.
So I will just add too that image on the left was a graphic I prepared in the previous city I worked for, where we did implement code to allow. What I don't know is how successful it's been in having anybody to build it, because I think it was something staff was interested in seeing being allowed, but I don't know if the developers or market was interested in pursuing it or even understood it from that perspective. So, but it is, and that was not on the West Coast. So they are being added in some of the ADU research I did. I found that some of those communities that we would look to as examples of being similar to ours were looking to implement cottage neighborhoods. So they are becoming more common and more something that people have seen and want to have in their own communities.
Can I
Or at
Google
least
it?
as
Where
an
was
option.
that? I could Google and see if they've built any since then.
Yeah, I need
She
to
can
do
call
that
her old
too.
boss too.
Well, my old boss retired.
Okay, so she can't call her old boss.
But yeah, it was Fayetteville, North Carolina.
Oh, cool.
So military town.
I think AARP was featuring cottage neighborhoods quite frequently as opportunities for communal living and perhaps mixed generation living, so that you could get rid of some of the onerous burden of the lawns and all of that care that you would have to do if you were living on your own.
There's a lot of similarities between younger folks who
Mhm.
haven't had family yet and older folks who have downsized or don't have the need to accommodate a family in their home. So yes, they're multi-generational from that point of view. So this next slide is on 3 and 4 plex housing examples. So the one on the top left is an example actually here in Ames in Campus Town. So oftentimes the end of the unit, the end of the building is what faces the street. That has a very attractive end unit. That wouldn't always be the case unless you do require it in your code. These other examples, so that's a 3-plex, the one on the left. These other examples are 4-plexes, and I don't remember where they're located, or actually the one on the right is the graphic. So I don't know where it's been built, but it shows the front view from the street and then the side view. And so you can see from the side view, it actually is like a replica of the front that faces the back. And it's actually the main entrance is on the side of the building and not on those porches that face the front. So anyway, just showing you some examples of what is being proposed for 4-plexes around the country.
So one of the diagrams that we saw from RDG when they were envisioning what could happen around Hunt Street showed the location of a current apartment that's on Welch Avenue. That's a 4-plex.
Okay.
And that one, I always think, looks like the apartments that were in the neighborhoods in the Twin Cities. You know, something built probably in the 20s or 30s, brick, shotgun loaded apartments, 2 stacked on either side of an entry. And I'm wondering why we haven't seen anything like that in the samples because I know in the Twin Cities, those blend in very nicely with single-family neighborhoods, but they don't look anything like the single-family homes that surround them.
Can you send me the address for that if you know what it is?
It's right across from Stomping Grounds, next to.
Yeah. It wasn't in
fraternity.
anything we have tonight though, right? It
No,
wasn't on
no,
that-
it was,
that
it
on-
wasn't in any of this, and that was what made me think. It just shows up as a square on that RDG
Okay.
map, and it says, an opportunity for 10 units instead of 4 units. But it seems like it fits on a single lot, so but it's not end loaded like the threeplex up on
Okay.
the upper left. It has a frontage and is, a 2/2 around a front entrance that goes back on the lot.
Yeah,
It's
we'll
304 Welch.
304 Welch.
Cool.
Thanks, Rachel.
we'll look at it and see what that means. I might.
It may be the only example of it in Ames, but they're all over in the older neighborhoods in the Twin Cities.
It's not sticking out in my head right now, but
So a lot of times infill development does introduce new and sometimes bigger buildings and different architectural styles. So Ames Plan 2040 really emphasizes context, and that being the best way to minimize conflicts with transitions that would occur between what is already there and what's being brought in as new. And that takes a little bit more attention. It may take more customization and not just a building prototype from, a template that a developer has. It may require more effort than that.
so I think at this point we're going to move into those slides that kind of talk about some of those things that I think staff believes we should address as standards. We listed in the staff report on the second list. We have a list about ADUs, and then we have a second list about design features that staff thinks is important. They're pretty common. We're not breaking new ground here, saying that good design can be defined. Our zoning right now does not really deal with design, other than village, and village is a one perspective for one area of town. It doesn't apply citywide. I think one of the, and Eloise just said that, when we're thinking about infill, there's cost efficiency to a builder to do it one way, and it might not be the way that we're looking for. So I think you have to be really clear in your standards about what you will accept. So there's not that controversy of what's really going to be allowed. I might have done this across town. I might have done it 7 years ago. That might not meet what we're expecting now. So if we write these standards and we develop things, that might mean we're going to get different types of housing, and that's just going to have to be the way it is if we're going to allow this into neighborhoods. So some of those main features is really that orientation and setbacks. As Eloise and I talked about this, a lot of our neighborhoods really have kind of uniform setbacks. It's not like other towns where you might have a house that's 50 feet back and a house that's 30 feet back and one that's all over the block. So you're trying to figure out, what does that mean? A lot of uniform setbacks in Ames. So that's probably not the biggest issue. It really comes down to that orientation. And it seemed like one of the biggest ones will be just that garage. Are we going to be about that the garage is the first thing that you see because I got to park the car? Or are we going to make it so that you have to find a way to put the home on the lot? And if you're in a neighborhood that does not have a front protruding garage, that's not your solution. So those are the kinds of things that we don't deal with right now. You can go in an FSRL zone. There's no limit on where you put your garage, just whatever it is, be 25 feet back from the street. It can be the first thing you can see. It can be in the back of the house. It can be on the side. We don't care. That's fine. That's a new neighborhood. Everybody's moving into the same thing. They know what it is, right? If you live in an existing part of town and that's not your block, and you start to see the examples on the bottom pop up on your street, that's where we're going to get the negative feedback that this isn't what my neighborhood is. We're not respecting the block that I live on. So that's the kind of thing I think we're going to be focusing on addressing if we allow for this to happen. This kind of relates to setbacks. A lot of cities want to make sure that they maintain that greenness. And what I mean is really vegetated or landscaped area in that setback, that it's not just a concrete area. I think our driveway standards are going to get us there. With the standards we're just about to adopt, we have limits on driveway width. You can't just pave your front yard because that's where you can put a parking space. So I think that we'll be okay on this one, just using our normal standards. Shared parking is a good solution to try and take 2 lots, share that driveway, get space to the back of the lot for the parking, see how many units you can fit on the front of the lot. That's kind of what we're hoping for. If you don't have enough room to put 2 units on one lot, 2 lots together might get you 4 versus not even be able to do anything with just 1 lot. The rhythm of the development, I think, is another one. This is what I think we're trying to avoid. This is why we adopted SEFCOD in Old Town. You can't combine lots in Old Town. So even though we have a medium density zoning district, you cannot alter any lot and merge it. So that example in the middle where you took 4 lots and made 1 apartment complex, we can't do that in Old Town. I don't want to be able to do that in Old Town unless there's a reason that you could do something like the picture on the bottom right. Clearly 2 different looking units. They're attached, but they look like 2 different people's homes, right? That's what we're going for. There's an example I drive by a couple times a week on Northwestern. There's like 3 staggered townhomes, right? Like it just makes sense. You drive down Northwestern and you just see those 3 staggered townhomes.
It's a cute.
You don't see it anywhere else in town, but I was like, well, that's what we're talking about. That's the kind of thing that could fit in a lot of places, but we don't have a lot of great examples of that. Height is an interesting one. New construction is just built different than it was 30 years ago. When you get into 9-foot ceilings, you have elevated entries. It's still a 2-story house, but it might be 5 or 6 feet taller than that house that's next to it. And then if you're putting that next to a 1-story house that had a low pitched roof, it can be considerably different. I don't have a great answer for this one. I think what we're showing here is maybe having step backs for second floors or maybe third floors where you do have to bring it in. Like I mentioned on townhomes, you used to have a reduced size on a 3rd story. That might be what we need to do if you're going to go to 3 stories. It does cause privacy issues too. You'll start to get those comments as we do more infill. It's like I got a window that looks right down in my backyard from 20 feet above me. I never had that before. Or so window placement, we don't really have a slide on window placement, but some cities really get into that and want to make sure that not just from the balance of the aesthetics on the front that your windows make sense, but trying to understand how privacy works on side yards. I don't know that that's where we need to get to, but it does come up in other places too. I think massing ties in again with roof and height, a lot of different pieces here. Are we doing boxes or are we trying to make it look more like what you would expect a single family homeowner to probably purchase? Now, again, we don't make single family homes do this either really, but I think it's just different when you're going into an existing area. There's some expectation that you're not changing it. You're working within those boundaries. Unfortunately, I wish I could point to great successes in our city. We tried to do this concept in the South Lincoln area. So that area from Walnut to Sherman, 2nd to South 4th. We have some pitched roof requirements and a couple other elements. It was all designed to reflect those 1-story kind of craftsman cottage homes that are generally in that area. It doesn't scale to the size of new buildings. It just because you have a roof pitch standard doesn't mean it works if the building itself is already 3 times bigger than the building that was next door to it. So I think we've learned from that. It sounds great on paper, but there has to be a little bit more to it than just match the roof pitch. Or a really steep roof pitch works on a small house. It does not work on a big house. It just looks bad. So
What's the graphic on the right supposed to mean?
the white one,
That's what I was going to ask.
What is that showing?
I think it's trying to show the habitable space and then how if you change the roof lines, what it means to the habitable space on the 2nd floor.
And how it perceives in its height by changing it.
So like the top one, right, is your standard 2-story square home, maximized 2nd floor space.
Yeah.
But as you change roof lines, you reduce that habitable space on the 2nd floor and make it smaller.
Well, 4 just doesn't make any sense. Why is 4? I don't know. I just don't.
Dormers?
But I
Yeah,
mean,
it
you
could
have
be
part of the
dormers.
building above the roof. That doesn't make.
Well,
It could be roof dormers. So it's almost
Oh,
more like
they
a
stick
1.5
out.
story instead of 2-story.
Yeah, interesting. Okay.
So you do have some space on that 2nd level.
So we've touched on this a couple of times. If we're going to allow for infill of probably more than 2 units on a lot, parking's complicated. So anything we can do to address how to share parking, how to minimize it, Getting the housing, I think, there's a balance here. Getting the housing is a priority, but you can't overrun the existing area either without having any parking probably. So different approaches. Some are in the rear. Got the one at the right. It's 1-car garages that don't dominate the facade, right? So we already allow for a single family home to use stacked parking. We don't require a 2-car garage. You can do a 1-car garage and have that second space in the front. So that structure on the right, if we allow duplexes, we could allow that now. Some of them are rear park, some are side loaded. Just, we got to have some flexibility to make this work. Otherwise you just can't do it. Parking will just kill most things.
And is that something that you're going to come back to us with
think
suggestions on?
Until I know what we're trying to accomplish, I can't tell you what you need to change for parking. So I other than the townhome one, which I already gave the motion on, where we just need to,
Townhomes and cottage neighborhoods.
yeah. But parking in general, until I know more about what we're trying to accomplish, I don't know that I have suggestions on exactly what to address. Okay. I mean, I think we're still expecting 2 spaces for a detached house. If we're not going to require that and go down to 1, that's something I'll need feedback on later, which then has interplay with the rental code, because the rental code requires 2 spaces for a single family rental. And zoning also requires the 2 spaces. So they match, they make sense. But if we're going to start letting new structures get built, it's going to have a whole ripple effect on if they can be rented or not. Unless you adjust the rental code, then you unleash a lot of other things that maybe we weren't intending. So there's relationships here that are going to matter depending on which direction we go with this. Just another parking diagram trying to show rear parking, side parking. And this matters for accessory dwelling units. I think this is what we're trying to get to here. If we're going to do accessory dwelling units, let's say this is example, the red is the detached accessory living unit in the back, right?
Mhm.
The house is in the front. Are we even going to require parking for the accessory living unit? If so, what's that number? Is it just 1? Does it have to be accessible for that living unit separate from the house? There's just a lot of questions about how accessory living units work. Some states require you to allow for accessory living units, and then they'll cap the parking at 1. If you're going to require more than 1 space, it's probably going to be pretty hard to do any accessory living units.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty safe bet, right?
Mhm.
Yep. I think if you're going to do it, 1's the most you could require.
Well, and even in that diagram on the right, it doesn't meet what our code is now for. We have a maximum 25% of the rear yard that can be
Mhm.
occupied with an accessory structure.
Oh, yeah.
And we also have a maximum impervious area and a maximum building area. We have all 3 of those. And probably that diagram doesn't meet any of those 3 as it's currently written.
Probably.
What was a flex house?
Which one is that?
That was on the left. Is that,
Flex out.
It might just mean that it could be a single family or it could be a
Mm.
duplex, a 2-family.
Mm.
I'm not sure what they mean by the flex house term.
Just more parking configurations that we talked about. Just again, shared rear access, shared side access is going to be really helpful about making this work if you have more than 1 lot. So we're going to try to do a quick exercise. I think you guys have pretty up to speed on what we're talking about, but we gave you some examples of I don't know that you can answer them, but to kind of talk through, is this really what we want to allow, or is this something we want to make sure we don't allow? That's how I look at it. So again, across the city, I have no rules other than in Somerset that really tells you how to build your I take that back. CEFCOD and Old Town. That's the only place we really define what a single family home looks like and what it needs to have to be permitted for new construction. And then Village in Somerset does. The rest of the city, 3-story house, it can be as upright and straight and boxy as you want it to be, whatever roof pitch you want. So I think what we're talking about here is, if we're going to allow a 3-plex or a 2-plex or a duplex, do you get to make the most efficient box possible, or do we expect you to do better? So that's kind of what we're talking about in these different areas. Now, another thing that's interesting, again, we tried to deal with this in the past. This is not the first time the city's brought this issue up in our university overlays. for apartments, not for single family homes,
Mhm.
but for apartments, we have a couple of design features. And one of them is that you're supposed to have a covered entry. Well, the thought there is there's a lot of porches in South Campus and some of those other areas. So yeah, covered entry makes sense, right? It makes it more compatible. Well, any token covered entry is considered fine. So even like just on that square 3-story building, that little skinny post covered entry is considered equivalent to a porch on a house from 1940. It's not even close in terms of compatibility, but zoning said covered entry, 60 square feet, good to go. So we got to be careful on what we write, or you still won't get what you're hoping for.
Would that corner house meet our solid void ratio for the side? That
We
front
don't
center?
have a solid void.
Don't we? Well, we do in the
Only
historic.
in the historic district.
Okay, I thought it was everywhere. Okay.
Nope. Just
Yes.
historic district has the solid void is basically your window ratio on
And
a
I'm
facade.
glad you saw that because, yeah, it's on a corner, but that one side of the building is totally blocked off from the.
It gets to be a challenge, like the one Hayward example where we had the 3 townhomes.
Mhm.
Stairwells, like you want windows and engage the street. Well, when you build the stairwell on the front side of the house, they don't want windows, or there's no point to the windows because there's a stair going through it. So there's floor plan matters, and we don't really control floor plans unless you put window requirements on a building. Developers are going to do what's efficient and what's about the floor plan rather than what's about the facade. So, and I don't know. I mean, those are probably bedrooms or bathrooms, and it's going to be tough to put windows in closets, right? Like, so each bedroom is going to have a closet. If that side wall is your closet, are we really putting fake windows in? Probably not. But those are things that do come up. I'm probably more engaged on the front facade than the sides, but it is a question.
And is that the kind of design element that could get deregulated by the bill in the legislature?
Yes. So as I noted in the staff report, there's a bill that's not yet adopted. As proposed, I in no way could tell someone what type of windows to have on a property that's less than 12 units on a property. That's one of those things that would be forbidden. Historic districts are their own thing. So that bill that I reference, in special districts and in historic districts, you can maintain design standards. So they carved out historic districts, recognizing they're unique. But just basically all of your RL, all of your FSRL land across the city, you could adopt no standard that in any way manages or controls how a window, a door, building materials, things of that nature are allowed on a house.
Can you set height restrictions?
You can still do bulk. I think the way it's worded is you're still allowed to regulate bulk and mass and orientation. Well, if I can't control doors or garages, I'm not sure how I'm controlling orientation. But so when it gets adopted, I'll figure out what I have to deal with. For the most part, we don't have rules, so it's not going to be a huge impact to us. I'm way more concerned about the things we want to allow, and we won't be able to manage it in a way that other people will be okay with it. That's what I'm concerned about. But until it's adopted, I don't really know exactly how our hands are tied. But it is an issue, I think. So here's another example. And we don't have to have answers. It's just, single car garage, a covered entry. Is it or isn't it? Is it 3 stories? Is that too much? Should it have been 2? Does it have the right mix of features to be okay? Those are things we need to be able to answer eventually as we go through this. So that's 2 8-foot curb cuts right next to each other to get to those garage doors for that duplex.
And there weren't any on the block before that, as apparent from this small segment of the block. Didn't look like they had any driveway.
Do you want us to be answering our thoughts on these, or is it just a thought exercise for
I think it's
ourselves?
more of a thought exercise.
Okay, okay.
I know what you think now. So this is that same example, right? And we just flipped in a different picture. So now you have a 2-story instead of a 3-story. So we did this on purpose, kind of just, similar idea, covered porch, gables on the roof, just different scale, right?
And no front loaded garage.
And the garage is in the side, or whatever parking
Side
there is.
driveway.
is
Wait,
in
go
the
back one
side
more
of-
time. So height's about the same
Right, the heights.
I would say it's probably at least 8 feet shorter.
on the tree.
Because this is
Mhm.
2-story versus 3. So I would say it's shorter. I don't think those are like 13 foot tall or more.
Gotcha.
So that's kind of what we're getting at. So this will be tricky too, because all of our zones allow 3-story houses. So you can go into Northridge Heights and you can build a 3-story house. You mostly only see that when it's on a sloped lot. Once in a while, you'll get a flat or a standard lot where someone does do a 3rd level of something, maybe a little bit, not a huge 3rd level, but you get it now and then. So that's going to be a tough one. We allow 3-story houses across the city, but we don't really see them, or they're on a walkout basement kind of situation. So if I allow a 3-story house on the lot, that's not what we're anticipating, though, right?
But if the 3rd story is set back a little.
So that's where that inset 2nd level might either
Mhm.
only end up with one side having a 3rd level, or it's mitigated for height, or you just go to this design in the first place because it's the one that's easier to do and makes more sense. So it'll be interesting because on the 3rd story, we allow them across the city. It's just not utilized for infill, right?
Yeah.
We do have to. Where's that picture from the house on 9th? Where's that coming in? The one.
oh,
Oh,
that
it's
one?
right here. Perfect.
You led into your
Okay.
own question.
So this one was about traditional versus modern design, but the house on the top left is a 3-story house at the corner of 9th and Ridgewood.
Yeah.
So they did that addition. So that's an example of where, well, that 3rd story doesn't like dominate the whole house, right? Like it fits with the general idea of what that house is. It's a modern take on that 3rd edition. So this is, again, I don't know that we're regulating style. I really don't think we're trying to do that. But so you have that modern architecture for the 3-story house on the right of the red house versus the traditional architecture of the blue house on the left. But look at the one on the right. It has windows that make sense on the front of the facade, right? So it looks like, compared to that Hayward townhome where there weren't any windows except for one window looking into a stairwell, the modern one has windows. You think there's living space there, right? So it doesn't look like that slot home. Those are things that I would like to be able to have. I don't care that there's a curved metal awning over the front door, has a shed roof. That's not what we're trying to control. Staff is saying that's compatible. It's the other elements, the details of the windows, the orientation that we think are important, not the style of the architecture. And that's probably why we can't write real precise design guidelines. It's more about the elements of the building rather than here's the roof pitch and here's the, like in Old Town, when you build or modify your historic house, we have a pattern, essentially a pattern book that tells you what you have to be a colonial or be a Foursquare or something. Well, that's because we're trying to make you something that is in that neighborhood. That's not what we're trying to do across the city. So again, duplexes. If you have a single family home and you're going to allow duplexes, what exactly are we going to be comfortable with? This is the garage question in front versus the parking on the side or the rear. So it's a balancing question of what you're trying to get to. Then back to ADUs, we had this slide before. Ultimately, if we're going to go this route, we're going to need to understand a lot more about how much we want to. I think there's a balance. Are we trying to allow them or encourage them a lot? There's a big difference, because if you're just going to allow them, there's going to be very few sites that can do it. If you're trying to encourage them, that means you're changing regulations to make it very easy to do if you want to pay the money to build it anyways. So that's that continuum that we're going to need a direction on from council on how far we want to go with this.
For something like that, would it be something to consider to first allow it and over time then move towards making it easier to do, because if we allow it and encourage it a lot right out of the gate, you'd have more impact and you'd have more density built quicker. But if you kind of slowed that down a little and first allowed it and let some people trickle into it and then make it, like reduce barriers to doing it over the course of time, it'd be a better guard against any unintended consequences that you might start to see, maybe. So that's where I would, that's kind of what I'm thinking about, is that, first allow it and let it happen where it's clearly fits, like where there's plenty of room, plenty of parking already. And those spots are going to be rare. and the homeowners willing to make that kind of investment maybe are going to be a little more rare. But then over time, turn down the barriers at doing it.
If that's the route we go, and I think Eloise would tell you from her research, there's cities that started one way and they slowly evolved, generally making it more permissive.
So that's exactly what happened with Bloomington. They adopted their code in 2017. And when they adopted it, they put in a conditional use permit requirement. And at one point, instead of doing a conditional use permit, they thought about just leaving it as a maximum of 30 units that could be built. Well, they never got anywhere near 30 units, but they had the conditional use requirement. And then about 5 years later, they tried to open it up because it wasn't doing anything for them.
Yeah.
They weren't achieving their goal of having a variety of housing because nobody was building them, and they are quite expensive. So not every lot will allow it. And so they were able to then come back and change the code and to make it less restrictive. And they're trying to do some other things to also try to encourage the development of the ADUs. But there's some other things that they probably aren't doing that they still need to do. And the thing that starting slow can do is it can make it something people are more comfortable with. So you don't scare the whole citizenry by like what's happening to our city, even if none of them, even if there's not a deluge of ADUs built as a result, it could still be very scary for people.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Eloise, did your research on Bloomington involve talking to people there? Is
I
that
did. I talked with the planner there several times.
so? One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about regarding ADUs is that from the research I've done, they seem to increase the value of properties significantly. And we have already got an affordability problem with our housing here in Ames. So one of those unintended consequences to adding an ADU may be making a property more expensive for someone to buy as a starter home in the future. And I'm wondering if you heard anything from Bloomington about the increase in property prices because of ADUs? Or?
I didn't ask that specifically, but there's also the other side that if you have an ADU as a source of income for the person that the owner occupied unit to supplement their income, to help pay for their mortgage and also aging in place, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, but
Yeah.
I'm sure there's answers that say both.
I mean, it's interesting. The reason that it makes the property more valuable is also that guaranteed income too, basically. But it does also make the property more affordable while, so like the person who puts in the ADU gets
If
the
they're
benefit
living
of
there.
affordability of that property.
Right.
And then it becomes more expensive the next time.
Which means that we could be inadvertently making what passes for affordable housing in Ames unaffordable because we allow ADUs to be constructed and then they become attractive as rental properties, and single family residents who are looking for that supplement can't afford them out of the box.
Yeah, you could kind of say that about any home improvement though, and we'd want to be careful about that too. Like,
Well, but most home improvements aren't 180,000 to build initially.
well,
So-
no, but I mean, like if you put a lot of money into renovating your home or making energy efficiency upgrades and things like that, that'll affect the value too. But we would never dream of saying, let's not do that to the old houses in town, right? We want people to improve their properties, and part of improving the property is the value goes up. But part of me still thinks it could be a way to make it more affordable if people, again, because that's how my house was, right? So I got the income from that upstairs unit for a long time, and then and then ultimately was able to reach a point where I could reabsorb it, but that made that house affordable to me in a way that it would not have been before. So I think, I don't know, just that, but that's anecdotal, right? That's just the way I saw
Well,
my
and
property.
different communities have experienced different things. So in some places, adding the ADU actually lowers the property value, although that doesn't seem to be
That seems
as
surprising.
common.
Yeah,
Hmm?
that would seem
I didn't read
highly
anything
unusual.
that supported.
I can send you the links to the things I was looking at.
Okay.
It's surprising to me, but most of them are larger metropolitan areas than Ames is, and with very different housing markets than what we have here.
I have a question. So I'm struggling with how we think about ADUs across the community. So I still have the battle wounds from the rental housing cap exercise. And we thought deeply about the way in which we would allow the increase of density in the neighborhoods surrounding campus. And so if there are people watching tonight who are in those neighborhoods, they may also be having some flashbacks. So how would we as council take into account, without violating state code, is it possible we could designate certain areas of the community where ADUs are permitted? Or if we embrace this, it has to be done on a citywide basis? Could you walk us through that?
I think you can designate areas that they're allowed pretty easily by what individual zoning districts there are through an overlay or even the base zone. And state code does not address accessory dwelling units. So however we choose to do it, I think we're free to do that at this point. So if we want to allow them somewhere, I think we can do that. If we don't allow them somewhere, I think we can do that as well. It doesn't have to be citywide. I think we're looking at it as what's the equity issue. And I bring that up in the staff report. We're going to have issues. Newer neighborhoods just don't allow them. So it might be focusing all the way back to rental concentration. Same argument. The easiest place to do it and the only place to do it is where we already have a lot of density and people don't want more of it. And so there could be an equity issue here in terms of, is it equal treatment across the city? But technically, I think we can do it however we want.
And could you remind us how many single family homes are there in Ames? You remember the number? I used to know
It's
this.
on the slide.
It's in the staff report.
It's on the
Um,
slide
Slide.
5.
Mhm.
Slide 5, we have,
How many are there?
if you add that number, it's like 23,000.
That was an older census count.
This was the,
So we have about 10,000 single family detached, and there's a couple of thousand of other things in there too that I would consider not apartments. So it's, I think in the ACS, we're upwards of 13,000 1 and 2 family homes in the city
Okay. So
out
of,
of like
Close to
27,000 total.
so of the roughly 13,000, just as a rough number, what percentage of those are rental units already
Of which building type?
of the single family dwellings?
I don't have that. I can get that. So I can have inspections pull the property records and we can get you that, but I don't have that tonight.
So I thought it was somewhere around half. You think it's
Of
that
what
many?
number?
50%
Of which
of
unit?
the single family
No.
So-
Not in total. No.
in total?
No. It's
So the reason I'm asking this is that would there be an incentive if I already have a house that is a single family rental and I say, hey, I'd like to try to increase the amount of income potential, I'm going to look at that differently than an owner occupied perhaps. And so is part of our calculus, I mean, if all of our town was nothing but owner occupied and there were no rentals, I think this would be a different conversation. But I think because we have a lot of our houses that are rentals, those who have the capacity to add more income, we're certainly going to incentivize that. Am I right about? Do you think I'm right about that?
I think
possibly.
but it goes both ways, because as we look at the need for additional housing, we have a need for additional both kinds. We have a need for additional rental housing as well.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
So
But I'm just looking, I'm trying to this is always sort of challenging for council to try to anticipate the effects of these things.
So I think if I can recall back to rental concentration days, I think like a citywide average, we were in the low 20%.
20%.
Because we were talking about capping,
Oh,
I
that's
think
right.
at 25 or 30%. So I can't
Oh,
remember
yeah,
which
you're
number we're
right.
at. So I think like citywide it was 20%, but then you had neighborhoods that were well
Mhm.
above that. And
Right.
that's when we were starting to put the caps in. They were getting above 30%, I think. So it varies greatly across the city. So if you just take Northridge, you have over 400 houses there. And I just know this because you can look at a map of them and there's a handful of rental properties there out of 400. And then you go to another part of town south of campus and you pick 400 properties,
83% on my street.
something like that. So it varies greatly across town.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'd say average is 20%.
So, and I apologize, this is a long-winded subject I'm raising. Would you anticipate that there would be a greater incentive to add ADUs to existing rental houses? That's the question I'm trying to tease out.
I think so. I think if you already have an investment property and you're saying, where else can I put $150,000 to create income? And I don't have to do a lot of changes to the property or build something complete. I mean, you have to build the unit probably, but if I don't have to build a garage, I don't have to build parking and do all this other stuff, you're probably incented to do that.
And that's why I'm going back to our discussion of the South campus and this neighborhood surrounding campus is I think that those people who have an owner occupied property there are probably a little nervous that the ADU is just more density in their neighborhoods.
I think that's going to be your number one question or issue if we go out with this is how much more density am I going to get? How many bedrooms are in the units? How many more people are going to be living there? How many cars are going to be on the street?
But we are,
All of
I
that.
mean, the workshop is on infill. I mean, that is also the point.
So that's sort of the question, Brahman, is we can approach this from the situation, the perspective that we just don't care. We need infill and we're going to do it and we don't care. So that's one approach. The other approach is to say, well, we are interested to know, is the addition of ADUs in your neighborhood going to materially change the climate of your neighborhood? And if we get a lot of public input that's negative, we pull back on that. And that's a policy question for us to think through.
Well, I'm not saying we shouldn't say we don't. I'm not saying that we don't care. I'm just saying that is the intention of ADUs is to add density. And maybe there are neighborhoods, though. To your point, maybe there are neighborhoods where we don't start there. You know, maybe again with my concept of phasing in ADUs, right? You would allow it where we think there's room there that wouldn't substantially disrupt or damage the character of a neighborhood.
You know, are
Well,
we going
don't
to
we-
decide that or the neighborhood decide that?
We already have a slide 7, which shows us sub areas and infill candidate areas, right, from Plan 2040.
Right. I mean, that was one exercise, but yeah, it's an
So we did go through that during the planning process.
we didn't assess, but that's more like larger, it's either vacant properties or larger underutilized properties. No one's assessed. And I think we have a slide a little bit later on that Eloise said, hey, if we put a ADU on everybody's backyard, that's coming up here. Just kind of what does that look like? And is that even possible? So we never did an assessment. No one's done that assessment. We haven't been asked to do that assessment. Like how many can you really fit
Right.
in a 6-block area?
I would guess that in South Campus, it would also be very difficult to add at least detached
Yes.
ADUs because of lot sizes and coverage
So it depends if you,
restrictions.
that's what it comes back
If we
to.
don't change
You don't
the
change,
code.
You didn't
you don't
change.
change basic rules, and you're just saying I'm going to allow a detached unit to be built if you can meet all other rules.
You'd already have to have like a double wide lot, and you'd have to have, you know.
Well, you'd have to
I
probably have
I
at
could
least.
put one in my lot and a half
Yeah.
space.
Yeah. But not many
I don't even
people
know you
believe.
need that much space. And we can do that exercise for you if once you guys task us on what you want to know and how would things work, that's what we're here for. We're going to give you better information than this. But you hit it on nail on the head right there. If we don't change any other rules, how likely is it to build an ADU in Ames? It's going to be few and far between.
Kelly,
Yes.
isn't one of, and maybe this was Des Moines, one of their requirements, I thought, for ADUs was that it had to be owner occupied in order for an ADU to be built on the property. So that might be an option we can consider as well, if we're concerned about infill that's further exacerbating the number of rentals in particular areas, but wanting to perhaps allow, at least some of what I was reading was saying that when that happens and it's owner occupied, then that makes affordable housing for perhaps other family members or friends or others as part of that infill.
Yeah, I'm in favor of that owner occupied option to be able to get one. I'm not 100% sure that we can manage that under the current Iowa code restrictions on rental permits. I have some ideas if that's where we want to go, that maybe we can get there without invoking that issue through the rental code. But I need to know if that's a goal of us to make it based on it. So what we're saying is you can have an accessory living unit and you can, but the owner of the property has to live in one or the other unit. You could live in the small one and rent the big one, or you could live in the big one and rent the small one. That's a pretty common expectation or standard with Iowa code, where it says you can't limit the concentration of rentals. How exactly that interplays with that, I'm not sure right now.
And I'm curious, Anita, do you know when the property is sold and it was ADU was developed by the owner, could it be sold then as a rental? And so then eventually what you've achieved with having the owner occupied and the ADU, it's now just eventually flipped to both being rentals. How do we limit?
So
The
if
house
we're going to
from
do
being-
that, I would, so a thing that I would have pull from past experiences, we'd make someone file a notice of limitations, essentially a covenant on their property and a disclosure that you can't rent both units. And it would be through the city's rental program that we'd have to enforce that. But we'd have to put something on the property so that when people buy it, they know that it's not able to be two rentals if that's our standard.
It looks like Des Moines and Bloomington both have that owner occupied requirement.
It's very common to require and to have an owner occupied requirement, but it also is common in states that take some kind of implement some kind of requirement regarding ADUs for them to say you cannot do that. So like, for example, Ashland, Oregon used to have that requirement, but then when the state implemented their ADU requirements, they basically said you can't regulate those kind of things. And so that is a topic, Tim, that I've read about, that sometimes it's more difficult to sell a property if you have that restriction where it has to have owner occupied, for you can't rent both units. That was the one thing that was spoken out against it being owner occupied as an idea. But I mean, I think having owner occupied does give some restrictions to the numbers that you're going to get. But then with your concerns about rental proliferation, it would help to satisfy that.
I'm concerned that would put us at odds then with what the legislature did in the rental housing cap, because it just feels like it's a back door to that. I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't gone through with Mark in detail about what maybe some options are, because I didn't know if that was an issue that we were concerned about. So if that's something, a road we're going to go down, obviously we'd be visiting with city attorney's office in what there's some ideas about, are we capped on how we do rental permits, but does that actually restrict what we allow as a building permit in the first place? If you're getting exceptions to standards to build it, can you put conditions on it? Like there's different avenues that might allow you to get to some control on that issue, rather than just an outright cap or limitation, which is clearly what the law said we can't do.
Yep. Thanks.
And if Des Moines is still enforcing theirs, that's a little bit of a precedent, because we've had just over 2 years where we can't regulate concentration of rentals. And if they're still administering that, then they must have a legal opinion that says that doesn't violate that.
Yeah. Interesting.
So I think we talked a lot about accessory living units. There's a few slides here, so I'm not going to go through them in great detail. But if one pops up that we should talk about more, Again, this is why we're here tonight, implementation strategies. We've talked about design, parking, size, all those issues are going to come up depending on what we want to do. These are going to be quick examples of, detached units. They're probably the, that's put in your backyard, basically. How can I use up space in my backyard to get a living unit? Here's a front yard, backyard view. If it's in the back, you don't know it unless you're one of those 3 abutting neighbors. So that's a good option from a compatibility. Then maybe it's easier though to do additions. Maybe you don't have room in your backyard. The one on the right's a pre-designed home, like that's a new build, where it's a flex space, where it could be a separate unit, it could be just extra space in your house, it could be a lot of different things, and that's a new build. That wasn't an addition. The lady on the left here is showing I guess she's very proud of her addition of a second unit. I don't know where you got that picture.
Yeah, it's a lady who, her daughter or son lives on the other side, and it was a way for her to age in place by having an ADU on the same property.
So here's again, floor plans, just different ideas. Some new builds have some people are putting flexibility as developers. Is it office space? Is it a second unit? Is it a garage? Just different ideas. These are good pictures to show you how maybe attached units work from a new construction perspective. I think most commonly they're designed around the 1 bedroom. So it's not the idea that you're building a 3-bedroom apartment in the back. So if rental code was applying, you'd be allowed to have 2 people. You get 1 more than the number of bedrooms. So if we applied our same rental code logic, we build 1 bedroom, accessory living units, you're allowed 2 adults in that structure. So that would be the answer to the public. What's the density? How many people? It's going to be 2 in that structure if we allow 1 bedroom. I'd say that's pretty common that they're restricted to 1. Do you know of anybody that doesn't let you restrict it to 1?
It's very common to go up to 800 square feet, which is a 2-bedroom. And a lot of the people who first started with the smaller maximum requirement have lifted it and gone even bigger than 800. And our accessory building code allows garages to be up to 900 square feet, just to keep that in mind.
So a lot of different other second-story examples above garages. It'll be interesting if that's what people choose to do. If you're building a garage, it'll probably make a lot of sense to do it. If you already have a garage, I'm not sure how that works. But the alley loaded ones seem to be the easy answer. So if we got new development happening and they're going to have any side loaded or rear loaded garages, it's pretty easy to do this. I can't allow it right now, but it'd be pretty easy to do it. Our PUD ordinance does allow for it. We put that in there when we adopted that. If someone wants a second unit on the property, you can permit that in a PUD. So new build development, you can do this, but not existing development.
So Kelly, in the staff report, let me just see what number it was. In the considerations for ADUs, which I think
Page
is
3.
page 3,
Yep.
yeah. There's some notes about the height limitations, and I think that's number 2. And then somewhere in here, there's the setback question. And the note said, should we have these restrictions the same as for accessory buildings? And we've had some discussions lately about height of accessory buildings and setbacks for accessory buildings. And so I guess my question is, why wouldn't we apply the same regulations if we've had these long discussions and developed the
Just comes back
code?
to how much do you want to encourage these, right? Like, so that top middle picture, that's right up. I mean, you can see that. That's right. It's 2 stories. That's over 20 feet tall, probably closer to 24 feet, right up to a property line. Is that what we're trying to say? Is because you can put a detached accessory building within 3 feet of your property line if it's in that backyard. It's limited in height to 14 feet or 80% of the house. And then if it's 2 stories, it does have to have some setback to it. But that's the question. If you can apply the same rules to everybody, and it'll just be harder to do, or you can try to go for that middle picture and say, I just want to allow it, and I'm going to have exceptions to height so that you can push it as far to one side of the lot as you can.
Seems like if we were to have that discussion, then we would have to be discussing all of our accessory buildings, because it's ludicrous to say it's okay to have this building here.
based on use. Yeah.
Yeah,
Probably. I would say it'd be hard to justify that a 2-story accessory living unit gets different treatment than a workshop above a garage
yeah.
that doesn't have a bathroom. Like there's no reason for that probably to be
I
true.
mean, the only difference would be that privacy one, where if you had a window, someone looking out into, whereas if it were an accessory building that didn't have someone living in it, you're not peering
Yeah,
right
I
into
think-
the neighbor's yard.
I
But
think
it's a
easy to
mass.
justify greater restrictions for the accessory living unit than the standard
Mhm.
accessory
Yeah.
building. I think it's hard to justify relief
Fewer, yeah.
for the
Yeah.
accessory building that has a living unit in it.
Right. No, that makes sense.
I would agree. But that all comes down to what are you trying to permit? Just an example, prefab is a thing. You can go buy these on the internet, deliver it, bring the crane, and you're good to go. You're done, right? So we'd have to talk to inspections if this was a thing. How exactly would you go about getting that done in Iowa? And still gonna have to have on a foundation and some other things. So we require all homes to be on a foundation. That's a basic. So that's tiny home question earlier. We don't allow homes to be on trailers. Like it's just not a thing in the zoning ordinance. You have to be on a foundation. So even if you're a modular home or a pre-manufactured home, that's illegal in the city. You just have to set it on a foundation. You just can't have it be mobile or on wheels. So the same thing if you brought in a prefab structure. I don't have anything that says you can't do that probably. It's just that you would have to also meet building code. Oops. Just a kind of a diagram. This is kind of those conversations we've been having on a standard lot, a 50-foot, pretty narrow lot, 50 feet. We have some of those, but that's a pretty narrow lot. How much space do you really have to put one in? That's what I think you made this drawing, did you?
Yes, I just wanted to emphasize that in doing this drawing and calculating everything, it meets the maximum building coverage, it meets the maximum site coverage, and it meets the maximum rear yard coverage. So this lot, even though it's a 6,000 square foot lot, which is our minimum lot size, would not be allowed to build a detached accessory dwelling unit. What they would have to do is either convert some interior space in the 1-story residence or convert the garage, but they couldn't cover any more. They couldn't have any more building to cover any more of the lot under our current code. And I actually think that these considerations do more to curtail the building of accessory dwelling units than almost anything else. And that even places like Bloomington, where they're trying to be more relaxed in their code to encourage them, they're still requiring the bulk standards that are in place. And if you don't look at those bulk standards, then you're not going to get where you're trying to go to. But in some cases, and very common, there is a standard for impervious, a maximum impervious, but there may not be a standard for all three of these. So just something for food for thought.
Could you put a green roof on a building and make it pervious again?
I don't know if our code considers green roofs as being pervious area or not. It's a good question.
I mean, nobody that owns a single family home's ever asked that. So I don't have any.
Well, it'd be
They're
easier to
pretty
put a green
expensive.
roof on a smaller building.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that would come up more, and if it would come up in order to get someone.
I think it's more
Around,
likely
like-
someone would say, I want to convert my driveway to a paver system and count this
Oh,
as
sure.
pervious.
And then not.
No,
count- yeah,
most
yeah,
people are not
mess
trying to
with the
change
building.
their
Okay,
roof.
that's a
right?
good
So
point.
They'll want to go to pavers before they want to put a green roof.
Very clever. Yeah. Okay.
I
And we
would
can
hope
deal
that-
with that.
Yeah.
We can deal with pavers if there's openings and it can drain through. We've counted that as
Yeah.
pervious. in
That
the
makes
past.
sense.
I would hope that we do not change the code to reduce the amount of impervious or expand the amount of impervious surface allowed, because as we're looking at our climate action goals, I think we need to keep that in mind. And if there are alternatives that allow us to maintain that kind of surface, that's one thing. But simply saying, yeah, we don't care, we'll let you cover more of the lawn, I don't think that's a good idea.
No, I mean,
So-
and I wasn't saying it was. I was just curious if yeah.
I just want it on record
Oh, sure.
because I won't be here after this year, right? So I'm sure this discussion will be going on for quite a while.
No, really?
This is Ames. It will go on
Things
for a
that
long time.
I'm here for last forever. Sure. Yeah, so that's interesting. 6,000 square foot lot. That's your max.
Yeah.
And so if you want to allow them, but you don't want to materially change the standards, maybe you make a carve out that in any event you're allowed a 600 square foot ADU. Like there's little things you can do about ADUs that may be different than any other standard, and not be completely hamstrung by those standards. Even though I agree they make total sense on this layout. That's just your typical layout for a house or for a lot in this situation. So those are things we're gonna have to get guidance on. Just more examples of parking setbacks, different options here. We use this for the accessory building amendments that we did 2 years back. So this was Eloise trying to take an example of an existing neighborhood, right? We have a mix of front loaded, or mostly front loaded, aren't they all front loaded properties? Yep.
Yep.
So some have side driveways you can get to the rear, some do not. A lot of questions come back to parking again, where if you require parking and there's no side driveway to get to the rear yard, how are you going to do it? You're not. Just different ideas. Not all of these would be approvable, but this just to give you a sense, if you allowed 800 square foot ADUs, are they really possible on these properties or not? It depends on the zoning standards.
And there was no evaluation of the lot coverage or the extent of the backyard, the rear yard being covered. It was just plopping down an 800 square foot rectangle on these properties to visualize it.
But the good, I mean, what I liked when she showed me this was like on Wilson, these, if you feel to get to the unit, you can't. So that would mean that's not going to be approvable, right? There's no driveway that gets there. There's no parking to serve that unit versus go across the street here to Clark. I have a driveway. I can get to the rear yard. I can build that extra space. I can do all kinds of things. It just kind of depends on where if you already have an attached 2-car garage or more to your house, you're probably not getting to the rear yard. If you have a detached garage, you're going to have options. And we know which neighborhoods have detached garages.
Do you have, and so one of the pieces of info that I maybe already someone's asked for it, but of these, given the coverage limits that we have, right? How many of them would like?
Well, I think it would be
or
helpful.
citywide, like that would be a good piece of data, I guess.
Right. I think what Kelly was saying is we need a little bit more guidance to know what you're looking at adopting before we evaluate how many lots could accommodate it.
Right.
Because, for example, what he just mentioned was about parking. If you can't, but if you say you don't, if you're only going to have a 1-bedroom ADU that's allowed, and maybe you say you don't need any additional parking, that's a whole different ballgame than trying to accommodate parking.
Mhm.
So we can go through and see, some places have evaluated how many total lots
Could
are
fit one.
available for an ADU, but it's
Yep.
based on the parameters of what that ADU would be.
Yeah.
And I think it'd be a really interesting exercise, but we
Yeah.
just need more guidance.
And Eloise, when you plop these things down, were you trying to look at setback at all?
No.
Or was it just?
I was just looking at the 3-foot setback for accessory structures, accessory buildings,
And that's for side and rear, right?
right,
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
rear yard.
But there is supposed to be a 25% rear yard coverage limit with that setback exception.
But you didn't look at coverage.
We didn't look at any of the
Didn't look at
coverage
coverage,
issues.
yeah,
So
no.
so some of those look like they're taking up too much of the rear yard. Some of those,
Right, right.
some of those would not.
A
Yeah.
lot of them are.
Because I do think, we need that info to know what kind of impact we're talking, I think, ultimately. But I think, yeah, you're right, too. We need to give guidance on that.
And certainly the ones that are on the street on the left, which was Wilson, those
No.
do take up more than 25% of the rear. It's really apparent.
It's the blocks that don't have an alley, right? Where you'd see,
Well, those
More-
don't have, none of those are alleys.
right. But I
That's-
mean, if you have a block with an alley,
Oh, yeah.
then no chance probably likely, right? It depends on the block maybe, but those alleys would probably cut the lot sizes down enough.
Not necessarily.
No.
Some of them are the same size lots. It's just that you have additional access.
Yeah, I think we both would say alleys might make it easier.
Yeah. I think
Kind
alleys
of
would make
depends
it a
on
lot
how that
easier.
garage is situated off the alley.
You have to have a separate entrance for like a ADU, right? Or, splitting a house, but do you have to have separate parking, or could it, I guess we haven't determined.
So right now, our code would say the parking for a single family home can be stacked, meaning that you don't have to have it 2 spaces where you can drive directly out.
Oh, for an
that-
ADU, could you?
So that's the question. So can I have a third stack space, which is essentially blocking 2 people, and you're again an unrelated party possibly? So is that really workable or not? That'd be a question. So if it's side by side, if I have a 2-car garage and I get to count the garage space and 1 back for the homeowner, but I can do a side space for the ADU,
Then sure.
then probably no issue. It's
Yeah.
those single car garages and single width driveways where I would say that's going to be tricky.
Yeah.
Isn't that stacking already allowed under the rental code though?
But we only require the 2 spaces because single family homes now only require 2 spaces. It doesn't matter how many occupants you have. And we count that. So it's the 2 in the driveway count or the 1 in the garage in the driveway count. So if you add a third parking requirement, everywhere else in the city other than single family, you have to have direct access to your parking space so no one else is ever blocking you that you don't have a relationship with. So I think the assumption is in the rental code and the zoning ordinance, if you're sharing a home, you have a relationship. You can go get that person
Yeah.
to go
Hey, I
move
gotta
the
move
car.
your car. Yeah.
If I'm living in the backyard and not living in the front, do I have a relationship to get them to go move the car?
I mean,
So if they don't, they're going to park on the street, right? And then that gets back to the question of how many people are on the street, how much activities in the neighborhood. So, when we have a better understanding of what you're going for, I think we have answers. It's just you can see it. There's a buffet here.
yes.
There's a buffet. I think we're almost to the end. A couple examples of things that are old, non-conforming, but would meet the idea of what's allowed now, or what we're talking about tonight. So just a couple examples. There's very few in Ames, but some older examples.
Are those all in Old Town?
Yeah.
The bottom right isn't, is it? It's to the east of Grand, isn't it?
Yes,
Or not to
the
the
one,
Grand, to Duff.
the bottom right is 215 East 6th Street.
Hmm.
And actually that's 944 square feet of living area. Sometimes and the one on Duff is 969 square feet of living area. So these old carriage houses had a lot of area above them.
I think we've talked about a lot of this. These are things that a lot of cities are putting as regulations. This is what we'll need guidance on. I think the owner occupancy is a big one. We have to look at that. And then, as Eloise said, a lot of cities, it depends again how far in the continuum do you want to be. These are things that make it easier to do that. So this is either lowering cost or encouraging participation. So this will be, again, related to how you want to do this. What do you want to do? What'd you say? Lot coverage is probably the biggest one in terms of if you want to change something to make it easier, lot coverage and parking are probably going to be the 2 that matter.
The things that impact the lot coverage and the parking is huge. Yep. And then also if you're going to allow non-conforming lots to participate. And, we didn't talk about costs, but these are not inexpensive. But if you have something you can convert, it is less expensive than building a whole new ADU. But a lot of people, if you look at cost of caring for an elderly person in your family, spending the money for an ADU might be lots cheaper than trying to put them in some kind of assisted living facility. So there's a lot of people looking at them for that purpose.
So there's a lot of different options here. We're not making decisions tonight. I think you guys gave us 2 motions to bring back information about pocket neighborhoods and townhomes of what would have to be done to do that. Tonight, we're not asking you to go through the list. So again, the staff report, I think, does a pretty comprehensive list of things that we're going to eventually need answers on. The second half of the staff report talks about some design elements, and you answered a couple of those, I think, about townhomes tonight. But we're also going to need some direction on just generally design requirements for the infill. So we have the issue, kind of the policy issue. Do you want ADUs or duplexes, and how do you want to facilitate them? And then secondly, for all types of infill, whether they're ADUs or they're townhomes or small apartments, do we have some design expectations, and what zoning tool is going to get us those design expectations? So we're going to need, we're going to have to take that in bites. I think when we come back in April, you're going to have to tell us what you want to do first, design guidelines first, then go approach the ADU issue, just tackle ADUs and leave design guidelines behind for a while and just look at ADUs. And then the third one is the sub areas. Again, like there's areas of town where our policy says we want to do infill, but I don't have the zoning tools. So are there priorities for you to tackle first? And maybe, so for me, I kind of believe getting through the design guidelines section is the most valuable, because it can then work towards both the top bullet for ADUs and duplexes, as well as the bottom bullet for more intense projects. So once we get a basic package of this is what we want to see from different building types, understood, then we can go out. To me, I think it'd be easier to go out to the public and do zoning for infill projects, knowing this is what we're going to work from as a start. ADUs could be done on their own because they're kind of their own unique animal, but I would probably lean towards the design expectations first and then go to the ADUs second. But we'll see how you guys feel about that. In the staff report, you touched upon one thing that's a little unclear right now until this legislative session is over, how much we can do with design guidelines. So in terms of orientation, building, windows, materials, all of that. So we'll figure out what happens here in the next 2 months. We talked about concentration a little bit. From an equity perspective, I wish we could say this is going to be uniformly done across the city. It creates housing opportunities for everybody. We know that's not going to happen. We have a ton of subdivisions that are going to have covenants to say they're just not allowed. So you're going to have a lot of subdivisions from 1990 and on where their covenants aren't going to allow this to happen, even if you're willing to let it happen. So that's going to push, again, the emphasis is going to be on those pre-1990 neighborhoods where there's no covenants limiting them if zoning is going to allow it. And even new subdivisions, I'd be curious if we now allow them, will developers change their covenants and stop prohibiting this kind of thing from being allowed? I don't know. But it's not going to be equally done across the city.
Would it be possible for us to get information on what subdivisions it might be allowed or not allowed in?
Possibly. I think we have a couple of friends in the real estate community that might have access to subdivision covenants. We don't have them on file with the city, so I can't just go to a file and say, what are the covenants? I'd have to get access through somebody else. So we might have a pretty quick answer to that, but okay. I'll have to ask other people. And then
I just want to piggyback on what Rachel asked. Maybe this is kind of a different version of that question. Can we easily identify areas that have a high percentage of rental but are now zoned RL? So for example, my street, which I know is high percentage rental, and which is next to a high density zone, if we knew that there were those kinds of pockets, we could at least maybe look more closely at where we would want to change zoning to enable intensification.
So my first thought is I can pull out the maps we made during the rental concentration discussion.
Mhm.
I can't believe things are considerably different.
Probably not.
So if I can just pull those out and maybe that gives us a refresher for what we did. I think we tried to map the whole city at one point
Mhm.
with that. I would rather save energy on redoing that if those old ones are good enough to approximate it. So I'd look into that first and see if that's good enough to answer that question.
Do you need a motion for that?
If yeah, because I'm not 100% sure what you're asking for, other than maps of single family rental properties.
That probably is what,
Well,
if you
that's-
say we still have those
that's-
from those discussions.
So that's actually easy. I have a layer in GIS. I can turn on rental permits and I can just print a map of the city that shows you where every rental property is in the city.
And is that correlated with the current zoning?
I can put it on top of the zoning. Yeah. Yep. It's if you want me to like go calculate percentages
No.
and figure that's all the stuff.
No,
Okay.
no,
That's easy to do. We could give you that in an hour.
so you don't need a map or a motion on that.
If you want that, we can produce that quickly.
I would love to have that.
So map of single family rental properties with zoning.
Mhm.
Okay. And then the one other under the other issue, you had a referral request from Kurt Friedrich a few months ago that you put on the back burner to get to this conversation. So a unique situation for Kurt. He bought a property that is vacant that used to have a duplex that zoned RL. We've talked about this. Duplexes are no longer allowed. So there's a question there of unique conditions there. Maybe there's something but generally it's an RL situation. So unless we're allowing duplexes, I don't know what we could do to address that directly. It's on the edge of an area that maybe could be a zoning overlay that allows duplexes. He has neighboring duplexes. You're not answering that question tonight, but he does have that referral request. And I guess I'll eventually need some direction on if you want some more options presented. So what I think your choices are is if you were to allow duplexes in RL, that might work for that site. If you rezone a broader area than one lot, we can't just zone one lot. But if you want to zone like 7 lots that have duplexes for duplexes, then maybe that works for that site. The third option is maybe re-look at the definition of pre-existing. We modified that in 2018 to put that 12-month limit on rebuild on. That might be the unique text amendment that could be done. But if you want more information about options related to that property that are beyond or not part of this like broader discussion, I would need direction on that eventually too.
What about, I mean, you mentioned the timing and that you kind of thought design guidelines should come first. Would you say that's true about the duplex issue as well? Or that's a separate?
I think so, because I think I need to understand, and I'm not necessarily saying we need to build design guideline booklet with all the illustrations. Eventually we should get to that. That would take a lot of time. I think understanding what the principles are and have kind of like a working understanding through pictures from other people or other graphics, kind of some of the things we had tonight. We can get to a working document for that. I think that's helpful for the duplexes still.
Yeah. So you do that first.
I think so. I mean, if the garage issue is a big deal.
Yeah.
And again, the other one that's a big deal that's not on this, well, it is on the slide, is are we allowing new construction ADUs and duplexes where you let you carve up existing houses?
Right.
So that goes back to that 83 situation.
Well, it might be a garage, right? So not necessarily.
I don't consider the garage isn't a house.
So conversion, when you say conversion.
I meant a conversion of, so if I have a 1-family home.
Yeah.
Am I going to be allowed to split it into 2 units?
I guess when I heard conversion, I thought you meant garage too.
I meant conversion of a 1-family home into a 2-family.
Gotcha. Yep. I mean, I would say I'm willing to take your advice on timing. Obviously I am interested also in ADUs, but if the design guideline piece is more important first, that's okay. For ADUs, though I
think what I can do is when we come back in April, I think staff can propose a work plan that says this is how we would address this, and we'll need input on how much public outreach goes into which parts. And then you'll be able to kind of get a sense of what we're thinking and how much time might go into each piece, and then what you want to direct us to do first. I think that's probably the best thing, is to give you a more concrete work plan about what would be included in any one of these 3 things. And then you can pick what your priority is.
Maybe we'll know more about what the legislature's doing with the.
By the end of
design.
April. Yeah, I would hope that bill's decided one way or the other.
And the question about lot coverage and how many ADUs we'd be able to plop down in the city if we followed our current lot coverage guidelines. Would you have that information for us before we decide about whether to pursue ADUs at all or not? Because I don't know council's willingness to pursue them other than myself. But I think that piece of information would be helpful to know what kind of impact they would have before we decide if.
Doesn't that get back to Rachel's question though? Because we don't know which neighborhoods wouldn't allow them.
Well, we know we could maybe get that. I don't
probably pretty quickly just pick all subdivisions after 1990. And that's going to answer that question. There might be some, that might not be all, but it's going to be the vast majority. Right, Tim? Yeah.
Is that something that could be layered on with the map of the rental properties and zones?
That'd take some work. We could do it.
Possibly. I'm just trying to think through what data we have. Like there's a difference between creating things we don't have and just being able to
Mhm.
use information. Like I'm not 100% sure I'm going to answer your 35% building coverage question. We have a calculation for every property for impervious area because you have a stormwater charge on your utility bill. So I would probably start there to get to the impervious number, but to get all three of those, I'm not sure I have data for that without taking a ton of staff time to get there.
Well, yeah, I mean, even just using the impervious number would get us closer to, would.
Yeah, I would say I don't know. I have to think about what we can actually get that would be reasonably accurate or a
Sure.
good estimate.
Right.
Uh,
I don't want us to
Let me talk to
go
let me
in
talk to
thinking it's going to
GIS a
be
little bit.
possible on 50% of properties if it's really only possible on 15 or something.
I think the question is what's available through GIS easily
Yeah.
Mhm.
that doesn't rely on a lot of staff time
Yes.
to calculate.
Okay. Yeah, I'll talk to GIS and see what we can come up with and figure out how we can present that to you. We can probably come up with something, and then we'll decide if that's good enough.
I'm curious, Eloise, do you know in your work with Bloomington, at the end of the day, how many ADUs they have now?
So if you look at the chart that was your attachment
Okay.
C,
Okay.
there's a column that says success rate. And I actually called each of these places because that's not something you find just looking on the web.
Right.
And so Bloomington initially adopted in 2017, and they have had approximately 30 ADUs permitted in 5 years. So each of those cities is listed, and you will see that many of them have not had very many. Cedar Rapids has had 7, Des Moines 6, Lawrence, Kansas less than 15, Bloomington 30, and then you jump quite a bit into when you get to the Oregon ones because it's allowed by the state that you can't have any rules about restricting ADUs.
We should just tell the state.
So
It's kind of surprising they
Ashland
haven't.
has had 191 since before 2017, and since 2017 they've had 78, and then Corvallis thinks that they have more than 15 per year. So 15 per year versus 15 over 5 years, you know.
It's just a big difference. Yeah.
So it just
Oregon-
depends what you want and how it shows you that the restrictions matter in the final numbers.
Yeah.
But then again, there's other
And
considerations.
I would say so. In California, when I worked there, you had to allow them. The state kept saying you could only restrict them so much, and they kept loosening it up to where you had to allow them. Kind of like Oregon. You still didn't see a ton of them if you had impact fees, just the construction costs. But I would say it builds over time as people get used to seeing it, or maybe people see that somebody else did it, then they get the idea of what's possible. I would say when we first start this, you're going to get very, very few. You're going to have a couple people that are probably eager to try it, but it is not going to be a floodgate when you start this at all.
So that's sort of
Mhm.
my thought. I'm interested in getting more information. I think this has been a really helpful workshop tonight. And Brian, I think this was your idea to have this. I think it was well worthwhile. If we're thinking about our goal of trying to increase density, we're not going to cross the finish line with ADUs. It'll be a component, probably a small piece. What I am more interested in is what you brought up earlier, Kelly, looking at that Lincoln Way corridor, where we should be at least exploring ways that we can change the zoning to increase intensification. And I'm going to go ahead and make a motion to see if there's interest in this. I would move that we ask staff to bring us back recommendations of areas where we could change the zoning to increase intensification. And if you have suggestions on that motion, I would be open to that. But so maybe I'll just leave it at that for right now.
Isn't that basically what I asked them to do to identify the areas that are?
No, it's different. Maybe I misunderstood your idea.
I think it's kind of what I asked for in the map.
I think Tim's is different. I think Tim's saying, like, when I go back to the slide at the beginning and said we have urban corridor designation, I have no zoning to implement urban corridor. Tim's asking where broad areas of the city where the plan wants one thing and I don't have zoning for it.
A
Is that
second.
Oh, okay.
versus what's the concentration issue of rental?
Oh, yeah, because I guess my concern about the map was, can we find some more of these places where maybe intensification makes sense? But if what you're asking is, where don't we have the zoning available, I guess that's
And
different.
so I'm going to caveat my response to you when I come back. I'm going to assume we're going to adopt zoning that makes infill better. Like, I don't want to zone that RH right now with no rules
Mhm.
that just let you build whatever.
That's fair. This is just sort of the introduction to the conversation.
Yep. I can tell you right now, this is where I'll start. This is the key part of town where I think there's enough economic interest and it makes policy interest to see things happen in that Lincoln Way corridor and then in that RN4 area. And I'll see what else is around that kind of fits that same model. And we have the redirection areas, right? I'll put a more concrete response together, but we'll start here if under my recommendation.
So I think this is, if we have to be strategic about adding intensification, I think this is a conversation. I'm not suggesting this is an easy conversation. In some ways, maybe it's a more difficult conversation than the accessory dwelling units, but this is where you get numbers, is in areas like this.
Yep. And Howard's on this map, you look at Howard. Howard is that dividing line. On campus, you already had conversions, a lot of conversions to apartments. Howard doesn't have the conversions. You can see the lot pattern there, still the houses. So are we going to see those houses, or on North Campus as you get to Oakland? Are those older lots? Are those the ones we're going to let get combined to become multifamily structures? Or are we going to hold to the current lotting pattern, which is essentially 3 and 4 bedroom single family rental properties for student housing? So that's going to be your conversation when we go out for that kind of a rezoning question. What's allowed? How's it going to change? Where's the dividing line? It's always, where's the line?
So does everybody understand the motion? And Jeremy, did you get the motion? Could you read it back to us, please? Okay, all those in favor? Aye?
Aye.
Okay.
Anita, did we get you?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Do we have any other direction for staff at this point?
I mean, I totally agree that the impact is faster and more with the redevelopment areas, but I do still want to pursue the concept of ADUs in some fashion. I'm okay with it being slower, and I'm okay with design guidelines being first, and it being fairly limited to start so that we're not opening the floodgates with changes to the neighborhoods. But do you need a motion on continuing to pursue the concept of ADUs?
No,
Tonight?
because
Okay.
I'm already coming back, and I said I'll bring a work plan.
Okay.
That
And that'll
talks
be in
about
there.
more each of these big issues, what
Okay.
we could or would do, and then you tell us which way you want to do it.
Okay.
Yep. So we're already coming back. You don't need to tell us to come back.
Thank you.
Any other?
So Kelly, maybe also on the issue of growth, the Story County Board of Supervisors met in response to our response to them on the 48E agreement. When is that going to be coming back to us on council?
So before spring break, they had said they gave direction to draft a letter to us. I don't think they've put the letter back on their agenda yet, unless it was today. So I don't have any formal answer back from the Board of Supervisors yet. So I would expect it by the end of March. So if it wasn't today on their agenda, I think it would be next week. So my guess is in April, we'll circle back around to finish up the fringe plan issue.
And the current 48E agreement expires at the end of April.
Yep.
So it's getting pretty close.
Yeah, I don't see us extending it. There's either we're going to agree that where we're going and it's going to get done quickly, or we're not going to be in agreement and there's going to be no reason to extend it. So I'm not worried about it expiring at the end of April.
I'm
just going to break in. We're talking about infill right now. So the 2080 agreement is kind of peripheral to that. So if we wanted to continue that conversation, I would say we should wait until after we get the response from the Board of Supervisors.
As you will. You have the gavel.
Other motions or
Just-
anything?
Just from a work plan perspective, this is the number one thing you have for us to work on. So that's where we're going to get back to you in April. So we have a good understanding of where we're going to be working or what we're working on through the summer. I'm hoping the fringe plan is done in April because that was supposed to be done a long time ago. And we'll have a good idea. So think long and hard when we get back in April on the ADU and the duplex issue, what you think community outreach needs to be. Okay. That's your homework. You got 4 weeks to think about that.
And you will have given us some data on how many we could fit, or no, not yet at that point.
We'll get everything we can.
Okay.
I'd rather get back to you with as much as I can quicker than wait for perfection and push it out further just
Sure.
to get a couple more data points.
Yeah.
So if that's okay, I'll try to get as much of this answered as we can within the next 4 weeks.
I think the more information we've got, the easier it is. And anything in addition to what we had tonight is gravy, right? It's
That's
good. We
cool.
don't want you exerting yourselves on
much
this
yet.
in ways that are not as productive as
So
they might be.
I want to say thanks for your time and interest. Eloise did a lot of work to get the background information ready for tonight and to be here, and very happy to have a highly engaged council that's interested in this issue. And I think it's an important issue for the community. It's our first implementation for Plan 2040. So
We really
Thank you.
appreciate the work that was done on this. Thank you very much, Eloise and Kelly. Very helpful work session. And I'm sure that we're all excited to see what comes back in April.
Great.
With that, we are done with the workshop, and we did not have a non-agenda packet, so there is no disposition of communications to council. So I'll move on to council comments. Tabitha, let's start with you.
I have none.
Bronwyn?
None for me tonight, thanks.
Nothing tonight.
Nothing.
And I will simply say,
Anita.
oh, Anita.
Nothing for me tonight, thank you.
I'll just welcome back the ISU students after a break and hope that everybody is feeling refreshed and ready to dig in. With that, do we have a motion for adjournment?
Move to adjourn.
Is there a second? All those in favor? Aye. Meeting is adjourned.